Caliban was a rather pleasant divergence. At first, thinking his daughter had yet to arrive, he had decided upon a similar solution to Baal. Purgation of the dangers of the world, establishment of an imperial colony, integration of the locals, and moving on. Baal was abrim with mutation and creatures of chaos, a wild and wasteland-riddled world. Its conquest had to be done with a great army and dedicated slaughter. The least warp-spasmed lives were spared and left to become the laborers of the imperial city to be established there. Caliban was different. Thick and overflowing with life, flora and fauna both, with a notable lack of mutation amongst its inhabitants despite proximity to the Great Storm to the galactic southwest. The beasts of Caliban told him what he needed to know. A half-functional psi device of some manner, hidden deep within the planet, still working to draw winds of change from the warp and condense them for some purpose. Whatever its original design, now it served to create the beasts of Caliban. Grand and unique creatures of predation, filled with the mutagenic magics of the nearby warp, and filled with terrible malignancy. Most importantly, the beasts of Caliban took on the bulk of the twisting energies that flowed into the planet, leaving the rest of the population mostly untouched. Reservoir creatures that took on chaotic immaterium and converted it into creatures from humanity's collective fears. But they were creatures, not daemons. They acted as creatures do. Predator beasts with meat and hides and bones, all useful things when harvested from their corpse piles. He had made sure to sample many and found their natures had changed in the process from chaos to mere meat. Roasted and honey-glazed and delicious meats. It was delightful to realize. He had to go back to that place in time to study that device and understand its functions. He had half a mind to install a copy of it upon every world in the Imperium, assuming, of course, that it had no malign long-term effects. Indeed, he had thought that his daughter had not yet landed. Engaged in battle with two great white lions, one snuck around behind him. He had foreseen this and was planning on a clever maneuver. In his youth, he remembered slaying a great lion, a quest given to him to atone for a fit of terrible wrath. He did not recall the reason for his anger, or the face of the one who tasked him with it. A king, perhaps, or maybe a shepherd, or just a boy. It did not matter. The lion had a golden hide, which was unbreachable by mortal weapon, and looked quite handsome about his shoulders. Its hide was impervious. The flesh inside was not. He forced an arm down its throat and crushed the heart in his fist, he thinks. Or maybe he strangled it. It was slain regardless, and the quest had been completed without hindrance. He'd been planning on something similar with the lion behind him, claw gauntlet readied. At that time the sky cracked, the warp convulsed, and the life container that shielded his daughter from the warp smashed through the air and crashed into the lion's skull. Quickly slaying the other beast, he approached the container to find one thrashing in a manner only infants could, a mighty frown on her face. The corpse of the lion serving as her landing cushion. Oh, how he howled with laughter at that, taking up his daughter, emptying his satchel of trophies, and carefully swaddling her inside. Her sisters were quite surprised to see him remove her from the satchel at the end of the first day. His daughter, not a day old and already making him proud. Most pelts of his kills he gave to Caliban, to do with as they willed. The pelts of the two lions he made sure to keep, once for himself and one for his daughter, for little Atalanta. She'd need a fine cloak when she was finished growing. What better than her first slain beast? Seated once more on the golden throne, he focused. The bulk of his will was dedicated to maintaining the great projection of his soul, shearing away through the twisting narratives of the immaterium. A small portion of his will was dedicated to manifesting gentle images in the air before him, weapons of various designs. Resting in the crook of his arm, Atalanta stared transfixed, quiet for a child, and enraptured in the most fundamental method of learning humanity had. Mimicry. Not of the body or mind, however. The golden image of a sword gently hovered in the air before him, and slowly he made it act as if it was wielded. Block, parry, swing, thrust, all the motions inherent to a sword. All the narratives a sword engages in. A materium hollow image brought into being by a small application of will. A useful learning trick he had picked up some time ago. Slowly, crudely, Atalanta's soul changed shape. Its gentle swirls of light and color condensed slightly into something closer in shape to a set of crossed lines. It kept trying to lengthen, sharpen, but her control was not yet fine enough for that. Smiling, he slowly returned the images to a ball of gentle light and waited for her soul to do the same. A shapeless thing at one glance, a complex thing at another glance. A mass of bright and sharpened silver, folding with layers and potential, but in truth was merely one thing. Formless steel, yet unworked by the fire of her will. Then he shaped the gold projection into a spear and began the process anew. As children ought to do, she attempted to copy what she saw, and her soul did its best to lengthen, to sharpen, to thrust. It was perhaps the poorest spear he had ever seen. It was an excellent start. It was important to teach her many forms early, lest her spirit ossify into a single shape. Lusum had been his initial attempt, an experiment in some part to see if what he desired was even possible. A warrior that could aid him against the horrors of Terra, if not an equal, then a powerful son by his side. He had succeeded, but his initial process had been flawed, limited. The boy was powerful, the boy was loyal, the boy was not a warrior. He was a weapon. His spirit was mere fuel and memory, his metal flesh mere material to bring forth weaponry. His will was singular. He did not need powerful weapons. He needed powerful allies. But the boy's creation taught him much about the process, and with newfound wisdom he set to creating a second iteration. A batch of 20. But one does not start with 20 without first ensuring the process was understood. Malcador ensured he kept this in mind. Genocide was forged, then put to work on creating less costly prototypes. The primordial strands were wrought from base human stock, and few survived more than a century. Once he had finally mastered the process, he moved back to the initial goal. He had set to work, and soon enough, embryonic Atalanta had been sired. The first complete success. Lusum had not reacted strongly upon seeing her initial state, but the fixed gaze told him the boy was intrigued by the prospect of having a sister. Atalanta was drawn from the aspect of his life he thought would serve her best. She was drawn from his many blended memories of slaying great and terrible beasts. The times in which the sword in his hands was the most valuable treasure he possessed, and his mind raced with visions of how he might overcome the foe before him. She would be far better equipped than he. His soul was a sword, after all. As much as he favored a sword, it was not always desired. It took great amounts of focus for it to be anything else, something that he found troublesome many times before. Some beasts simply were not suited towards being slain with swords. Some required axes or spears, or, smiling, he watched as she attempted to crudely mimic the bow and arrow he let dance before her infant eyes. Her soul slowly morphing and twisting in the attempt to form the complex shape. Even bows. She would be far better equipped than he, for her soul was any weapon she could imagine, and her mind would race with visions of how to best use all things at her disposal in order to achieve victory. She was a warrior, not a weapon, and she would serve him exceptionally well. She had proved that what he wished was possible, and with her success he moved on to drafting her many sisters. Sisters such as 10, which he could distantly feel on the world just beyond the reach of his sword. He smiled. This trip was quite productive thus far. Once, when she was a young woman, barely more than a child, with slothful eyes and pallid scales, her patriarch took her to the balcony of a grand city on the surface world. She had never been to the surface of any world before then. She had yet to return to one. Her forebears ensured she knew of their depravity and indulgences. Barbaric and crude, genolines intermingling carelessly, great violence in open streets and dunes, and visible to all. Yet the patriarch of the ancient and noble Navigator House of Strix had brought her to the surface, and none attempted to discourage him. Tradition, they called it, something that sat sour in his mouth as she felt the whipping winds dry her skin and the dust accumulate in her eyes. He made her wait there, and a grand procession began through the city. Armies of soldiers in thick-clad armor and wielding great crude weapons marching down a massive causeway, war machines and ramshackle jet bikes following. She had complained loudly and incessantly. The patriarch ignored her impudent requests to return to the comfort of their voidship homes. Instead, he commanded her to stand next to him, pointed a webbed and clawed hand at the final war machine in the distance, from which a light could be seen even through the glare of the horrid sun. In the rasp of a venerable elder he spoke, "Daughter of Strix, still your tongue, open your eye." and looked to the horizon. With impertinence in her heart, she did as she was bade. The eye upon her brow, concealed from the common rabble with silks and golds, focused. Fledgling and childish, her eye was still covered in the fog of youth. The vision was burned into her mind. She could not recall in precise detail what she bore witness to on that day. Golden and bright and burning, a presence and idea carved into her mind and vision. A man, and nothing more was certain until the patriarch spoke again. Distant and withered, pallid compared to that all-encompassing heat. This is heaven. Do not invoke its judgment. It took her months to recover from that terrible and awesome sight. Her eye burned to look upon a much duller world, strained with images of light and thunder. Slowly, she managed to muster herself to see once more, and with the return of her sight came clarity she had never known before. The twistings of the warp were suddenly quaint to behold, their writhing no longer so horrid and sickening, the false whispers no longer so easy to listen to. Her eye had been open before, but clouded. Her eye was clear now, and the hearts of men were plain to her sight. She grew from the experience. Soon she became a young woman, and her sight grew more and more efficacious. It was not the greatest among her peers, but it was more than respectable. Then came to her noble house a message from the Paternova himself. The command. The Emperor of Mankind required a navigator for his flagship, the behemoth Bucephalus, 170 kilometers in length and crown jewel of Sol's shipyards. She had been chosen for the honor. She was confused. Many among her generation were more talented than she. Many could see further or clearer. Many were more refined or intellectually gifted. Why her? She had been told in short and uncharacteristically blunt order. She had been chosen for her beauty, and little more. Her sight was clear enough to serve well, but she had been selected as an enticing doll. High cheekbones, full lips, pearlescent scales, dainty frame. A thing to be pleasing to look upon, and perhaps used, if the Emperor of Mankind was even capable of indulging himself in mortal flesh as hers. If the logistics of such a union were even possible. She was not opposed to this role. It was her duty to serve her house, and this was perhaps one of the greatest honors that could be bestowed. Lady Navigator of the Lord Emperor's personal vessel, her, given to her for the fortune of her breeding. The knowledge filled her with turbulent emotion. Surely the Lord Emperor, immortal conqueror, great unifier of Terra, slayer of God, monsters, bane of sorcerers, destroyer of mutation, banisher of Xenos, master of gene forging, and lord of the golden host, deserved more than an appealing idol to gaze upon. But it was not her place to argue against the Paternova, so she did as she was bid, and desperately attempted to improve the clarity of her sight. To be worthy of the throne she was thrust upon. All resources were available to her in this endeavor, for her position afforded her great authority to requisition assets in the pursuit of improvement. It never felt as if it were enough to truly be useful. Even as her sight expanded day after day, she held the private suspicion in her heart of hearts that the Emperor could see further than her still, that he did not need her in any regard. It was difficult to merely see beyond the reach of gold, beyond the tip of his embodied will. Even as her gaze strained for paths between, even the once shadowy warp was illuminated by the light of the Astronomicon and his present blade, even as she saw further and clearer each passing day. The path always felt warm. It was only enough to arouse her suspicions, and nothing more. Reality cracked. An eye ripped away into the materium. A fleet of thousands slowly emerged from this tier, sheltered by the now fading vision of gold left in their wake. She wet her lips, and slowly closing her eye, she spoke aloud in the most refined Terran she could muster. "Lord Emperor, we have arrived at Medusa. Delicate, sweet, refined, elegant." That was what the voice of a lady should be. Yet her tongue felt heavy, and her collar felt hot as she spoke. Medusa, another world bearing another of his children, their location scouted by agents in his service. She felt her soul stain just looking upon it, choked in smog and thick with pollutants. She risked a furtive glance up and behind her at the face the patriarch bid her to memorize. Some days were clearer than others. Some days it was almost impossible to look upon. Young and old, furious and joyous, handsome and hideous. The features were impossible to know with any certainty, everything possible at once and nothing true. Other days were clear, and on the clearest of those days she could almost see his face. Strong-jawed, high-cheeked, bronze skin, straight midnight hair. His eyes were always impossible to distinguish, hidden behind the ever-present sunfire that served as his sight, his crown, and his halo. This was a very clear day. She could see a gentle, fatherly smile on his face. She quickly pulled her gaze from it, feeling as if she was shaming it with her vision, and her eyes settled upon the babe in the crook of his arm. One of his daughters, the youngest yet recovered, golden-haired and emerald-eyed, fair-skinned and pudgy in cheek. It was an exceptionally beautiful baby. He rose, and her gaze was locked upon the moment. She desperately struggled to not picture the body beneath his armor, brazen and broad-shouldered, smooth of skin and firm of muscle. She failed. Her face was unbearably hot. "My gratitude, Lady Navigator, ... buts." The voice boomed. It rolled like thunder and flowed like honey. It sounded like a war horn and a lover's lyre. It filled the room with its utterances and settled into her memory without motion. His smile was upon her, and for one moment heat had flushed out all other sensations. His gaze turned, and the moment was over. A distant part of her wished that moment had lasted eternity. "Deputy Commander Harren, you have my license. Carry out my vision. Pews." The voice boomed again. The man in question snapped into a salute, prodigious will alone preventing him from falling to his knees. She was jealous of his self-control. "Custodian Sanctus, I entrust to you Atalanta Dopplas." The demigod, clad in gold, snapped into a salute and adjusted his posture, accepting the daughter of the emperor into his arms with superhuman care and delicacy, immediately beginning to rock her in a rhythmic manner, bringing her eyes to rest. There was no need to command him to guard her with his life. That was already known to all parties bearing witness. Finally, the emperor turned and began to walk down the immense steps of his immense throne. His newly acquired cloak, made from the skin of some truly immense and terrible white lion, waved as he descended. "Lord Archmagos, please relay my use of the Imperial Teleportation Array and ready an expedition army. This world may contain relics of interest, but Watts, the red-roped and barely human priest, began to fulfill these orders at once, not pausing in carrying out his commanded duties. Pausing to reply would be moot regardless, for in a crack of archaeotech lightning, the Emperor vanished from the helm of his ship, commanding the grand machine that connected distant points with naught but will. How he was able to do so was unknown to her. He simply was. The helm felt colder with his absence. Sitting in silence as the others went about their duties, she chanced another furtive glance, this time at the golden custodian, gently holding the infant daughter of the emperor. Shamefully, she felt a great jealousy well up inside of her. Persephone the Eighth, daughter of the most ancient and noble house of Sturks and Lady Navigator of the Bucephalus, flagship of the Lord Emperor of mankind, found that she very much desired to hold the child and gently rock her in her arms. Her half-finished, almost knife chipped. Pausing in her work for a moment, she raised it up to inspect closer with a blank expression on her face. This salvage was overly high in carbon then, for the metal to be this brittle. She frowned and tossed the hunk of metal into the second pile. She would need to put it through an oxygenation process to make it useful to her, and it would be more effective to simply find a different section of the ruins to acquire metal from. She would leave this pile here and come back to it another time if she ever somehow ran low on metal. It was doubtful. There were mountains of material still left to dig through, and at her current rate she would finish her duty long before she had to resort to such low-quality material. There was no sense in attempting to destroy it, though. She'd leave it in storage just in case. That was all the metal sorted through. Standing up from the floor of the natural cave, she walked over to the immense chain, hooped through a ring impaled on the floor, attached to a wheel above, which was in turn attached numerous cogs, which were in turn attached to a crude air-blowing fan. Turning the wheel via a lever, she slowly wound up the immense chain until the weight it was attached to was far into the air, adjacent to the ceiling. Finally raised to its highest point and wound up, she let the device go and watched for a moment to ensure the mechanism still worked. The weight minutely began to fall, the energy provided by gravity twisting the wheel, which turned the cogs, which amplified the effect of the motion and twisted the fan to blow air into her smelter fire. The coals came to life with fire once more. Hot coals on the bottom warming and igniting cold, coals freshly added. The fan would blow for 12 hours, and the smelter chamber would be filled with new blocks by the time she returned, scrap metal melting and flowing into pre-built channels installed into the modular plate that contained them. Cast iron made for poor swords, but it was more than acceptable for clubs and hammers. Bludgeoning was more effective on the steel-skinned monsters anyways. Walking away from the almost auto-smelter, she hefted up her traveling bag once more, then fitted her gauntlets onto her arms and attached their cables to the battery in her bag. Choice bits of salvage from lucky finds in the ruins. The clans on the other side of the mountains didn't come up here, so she had first picked for anything she could carry. The arms were too heavy for delicate work, and wasting battery power, keeping them active, was wasteful. Grabbing her warhammer and emergency mace, she carefully listened for the hum of electricity outside. Hearing nothing, she slowly moved forwards to open the armor plate door and glance around at the mirrors she set up. Nothing around the entrance, safe to move out. She walked out the door and felt the air outside. It was much colder than her forge hideout, but that was a given. It was a warm day, and a slight glare of sunlight was visible through the smog clouds. Reaching into her pack and tearing through a chunk of salted meat, she considered what she needed to check up on. Hideout 1 wouldn't have her meat finished being salted for another week or more, and she had enough stashed away elsewhere. Hideout 3 was still recharging old batteries. Hideout 4 was still drying clay. She supposed it was time to kill another metal beast. It had been a few weeks since the last one. She had recovered, she was well fed, her new armor and weapons were done, and all outposts were running for a few more hours. Not Silverworm, the big bastard, was still too much for her to take on. Not Dagger Digger or Lightning Tail either. She needed proper projectile weapons for them, and she needed black powder for her smoothbores. Energy guns would be preferred, but she had yet to find any in usable state. Plasma eyes might give her a good projectile weapon if she could avoid smashing the plasma shooters. She'd need to be sneaky though. Her armor couldn't take the hit. No, safer to go for something else. A crash in the distance brought her attention. Slowly, perhaps a mile or two away, one of the many towers of stone, metal and glass began to groan and collapse, rumbling as it gave way beneath itself and sending vibrations through the ground. The distinct clicking noise told her its identity. Cutterclaws was a good enough target, she supposed. Unclipping the helmet from her belt and fitting it over her head, she attached the straps to secure it tight against her head and pressed the power button on the side. The words rolled over her vision, just as they had 1,000 times before. StarCorp Cadet, Class Utility, Helm Online. You have been approved for heads. Up display. Anti-dazzle flash compensation. Comlink. Trial. Error, no. Satlink found. Comlink will not function. .g, not function. Cutterclaws was fairly small as far as the metal beasts went. Right about as big as the tracked vehicles that carry the big cannons on top. A large, rounded oval for a main body covered in smooth plates and the occasional spike. Then 2 sets of manipulator arms, a larger pair on top that had blade sets built into the interior, and a smaller set that were blunt and used to grab things. Then revolving sets of 4 legs on each side and below the main body, allowing it to spin entirely around. Cutterclaws liked to find exposed support struts and cut them, sometimes leading to one of the many ruined towers collapsing over from critical supports suddenly no longer being functional. Like all metal beasts, it hated living things and tried to kill them whenever it detected such, which of course meant that the moment she made noise, it locked on and started chasing her. Her iron boots smashed into the concrete as she moved, ducking through a path between 2 buildings and out the other side, hopping over a stone barricade and into the second road. Behind her, Cutterclaws smashed through the relatively thin building, the heavy stone barely putting up resistance against the enraged metal beast, but enough resistance to slow it down. She had to take a rather winding path to her kill zone in order to make sure she wouldn't be caught in the process of luring it there. Metal beasts were almost always faster than her. Warhammer in hand, she kept running, coming up to a broken bridge. Immense and stretching across a massive plaza down below, she slowed her pace. The metal beast was rapidly gaining on her. She was running out of bridge. She kept moving forwards, waiting for the correct moment. She took her last stomp forwards. The Cutterclaw swiped. She ducked, stomping against the slightly raised section of shattered bridgestone, and twisted. The claw scraped against her helmet, carving a slice off the top. Her warhammer smashed against the track revolver for its legs, immediately yanked from her grip and getting caught in the mechanism. A chunk of thick iron now impaled in relatively delicate machinery. The revolution stopped for a moment. Its right side legs could not compensate for the end of the bridge. It began to slide off, and she was caught in the legs on the other side of the metal beast. Right where she wanted to be. Grabbing onto one of the raised armor plates on the bottom, she let herself be pulled along. The cutter claw turned over as fell off the broken bridge, and now she was perfectly positioned upon its underside, now facing the dark clouds above. She had about 12 seconds to work. She reached down with her other hand, ignoring the futility thrashing legs and claws that tried to swipe at her, and the wind that whipped past her hair. Straining with her power gauntlets, she slowly pried the armor plate up and off, throwing it to the side. She grabbed her emergency mace, flipped to its spike-end handle, and impaled the critical power line that fueled the claws. She was mostly out of time. She threw her mace to the side and braced herself upon the underside. The cutter claw crashed into the relatively cool rock flow below with a titanic boom. Her limbs shook and body was flung about as the impact reached her. She kept her grip tight upon the underside. She'd die otherwise. This section was immensely hot, just barely enough for the stone below to still be semi-mobile. Sweat immediately began to build with the crash, and flecks of molten rock landed on her armor plates, flash welding to them with a hiss of rock on salvaged steel. The cutter claw was doomed now. With power to its claws now disabled, it would die in the molten rock. Now was a matter of escaping with her prize. Quickly moving, avoiding the still thrashing legs, she reached over to grab the now powerless secondary cutter claw, the smaller one. The bigger one weighed several thousand pounds. She couldn't hope to move it and escape the rock flow. The smaller one was much lighter, and more importantly, the perfect size for a new sword. She grabbed a protrusion spike and pulled it up, back towards the underside, as far as it would go. Once there, she rapidly began to use her power gauntlets to undo the many small connectors that attached the claw to the arm. She swallowed. The terrible heat was getting to her. Finally removing enough of the connectors, she grabbed the claw with both arms and twisted, bracing herself against the underside and, snapping off her prize, the long and thin shear claw, only perhaps 100 or so pounds. Hefting it in both arms, she looked around her and considered her path for a moment. She reached up to smack out her backpack, which caught on fire from the ambient heat. Nodding to herself, she jumped. Landing on a cooler section for a moment, she kicked off again as soon as possible. Molten rock, despite being liquid, was more dense than anything she was wearing. She could walk on it so long as she moved quickly, provided she had something heat-resistant. Unlike her thick iron boots, which were already uncomfortably hot, she landed again on an even cooler rock flow and kicked off again. She winced as her feet began to blister from the oven they were in. It was still better than stomping on molten flows, barefoot at least. This process repeated again and again until she finally made it to a section of land that wasn't dangerously hot. Gritting her teeth of the pain in her legs, she stumbled forwards and then into a recess she had mapped out before, relatively sheltered from her surroundings. Topping down with a sigh, she set down her prize and slowly removed her boots to check on the damage. Her power gauntlets were made of a heat-resistant material, so they managed the hot metal just fine. She grunted unhappily at what she saw. All of the first layer and much of the second layer of skin was burned. Fortunately, nothing reached the fatty tissue layer, but the pain would be infuriating for a while. Quickly, she opened her backpack and retrieved the now very warm water container. Unscrewing her best attempt at a filtration lid, she slowly poured the liquid over her burns to cool them off. She grit her teeth as the pain continued to build. Burns were the worst. Water applied, she reached into another pouch and pulled out strips of horn animal leather, quickly wrapping them around her feet and lower legs until they were completely covered. Once done, she put her cooler boots on once more and stood up. Red hot in her legs, white blind in her eyes. She strangled her scream. "Bay-ia!" She refused to stumble. Grabbing her prize claw once more, she loaded up her bag and moved from the protected recess, only to immediately pause at what she saw. There was a figure before her. It was not a metal beast. A giant covered in golden power armor sat on the rock banks a small distance away. left hand covered in immense claws that shone blue, right hand holding her mace held before its gaze for inspection, the one she threw away during her earlier fall. The giant had long black hair and bronze skin. A faint light came from its eyes, and the glare was present even through the flash compensation of her helmet. She focused on the display. Sat link found. Comlink active on channel 1. She turned her focus back towards the giant. It was looking at her now. She tensed. About to run on injured legs, the giant spoke a language. She understood the words. An excellent hunt. Press. She swallowed. No weapons prepared. He'd been watching her. She narrowed her eyes into a sharp glare. What are you? She spoke the words in the language. She did not know how she knew this language. It was one of the many things that she simply knew. A mystery that she had no way of solving. The giant smiled. I am a father looking for his daughter. I have succeeded. W. She considered that for a moment, slowly moving into a position to more easily run if needed. The giant did not react. Probably not a metal beast in disguise then, but too big to be a clansman. Thinking over the words, she eventually came to a conclusion. You claim to be my father. You have no proof I can trust. The giant tilted his head, nodding in consideration. What would it take then for you to see this as truth? Plus. She waved a hand dismissively. Nothing. Everything you could provide could be faked. I've lived here alone, and you are a stranger. There is nothing you can provide to prove that you are truly my father. She grunted in thought for a moment before continuing. It doesn't matter if you are or aren't either way. What matters is if you're worthy of being my father. The giant inclined his head at that. I see, bless. The giant smiled. She found her eyes drawn to the expression. It made her feel successful. What must I do then to prove myself worthy of being your father? Press reaching up, she scratched at her neck for a moment in consideration. What can he do to prove this? The answer was simple. Prove his strength. My father must be at least as strong as my goal. He would have had much more time than I to gain strength and equipment. There is a metal beast that roams the ruins of this land. Massive, long and covered in armor. I call it the silver worm. It is the strongest metal beast I know of. If you could destroy it alone, you will be worthy of being my father. She explained, simply and bluntly. Any clansman would recoil at such a task, for she had seen them flee from the silver worm many dozens of times before. She was not strong enough to defeat it on her own yet. It needed to die and stop ravaging this world with its presence. She had no particular qualms about how it met its end. Unexpectedly, the giant chuckled before rising up from his seated position. I see. Very well then, do you have anything you wish to bring with you? You need to be present to confirm its defeat, no doubt. She considered it for a moment before looking down at the claw in her hands and grunting. She wasn't about to lead a giant back to any of her hideouts. No. We'll go now. She took a step forward. Her eyes widened behind her visor. There was no pain in her legs. The giant was already walking away, beginning to speak once more. Silver worm? I think I shall need my spear for this. Plus, plus. The giant paused before turning his torso around to face her once more. He was smiling widely behind the glare of his light eyes. I consider myself quite the old hand at slaying dragons, you understand? I have a practiced technique putt-putts. She stared for a moment too long before shaking her head with a grunt and glare. I do not know what a dragon is. This is a silver worm. The giant chuckled. All the same, Athena.Pes, she did not pause to consider the name, not yet. He had not proved himself worthy of being her father, so all his names were worthless to her. No further, no further. His daughter called out in blunt old Terran, stopping just before emerging over the ridge ahead. He stopped at once, and the procession of custodians and tech priests following them immediately stopped moving at once. She turned, face only partially visible behind her scavenged helmet, and continued. The silver worm can sense life from a distance halfway to the horizon. It is always hostile to humans. I do not know if it has moved since last I found it. The conditions upon Medusa were particularly poor enough that one of his safeguards had activated within her. In response to being lost in a place completely hostile to life, a basic reservoir of information would flow from their souls and into their minds. In combination with their body growing quicker in response to stressors, This would ensure that his children would be able to survive in nearly any environment without aid. It was unfortunate to see that it had come to pass, but it was good that he had woven such measures into them. Athena was healthy, strong, and stable, about all he could hope for on a world such as this. Fiery-hearted, stony-fleshed, iron-helmed. If any of his daughters were to suffer enough to trigger his safeguards, it was fortunate that it was she designed to best handle such. He had wandered the world after leaving the ruins of Atlantis, and in time he found the familiar pleasures of warfare, women, and wine dull to his senses. He had no equal in battle. He had laid with many of the most beautiful women of all parts of the world, and sampled the finest of wines and ales. In idleness he had sought something new to busy himself with. The sparks from a nearby blacksmith ship drew his gaze. Remembering that his father, from what little he recalled of the man, was also a smith, he decided to master the forge arts as well. From then on, whenever he moved to a new land, he brought his tools with him, and sought the tutelage from the local masters of metalworking. The sparks and joy of mastery brought him a newfound passion for life. He had always practiced the art of war, loving and merrymaking. Adding the practice of the smithing arts to his repertoire was simple enough, although this too eventually dulled to a comfortable familiarity. He kept up the practice, but there was little else to master after a point, and his interest in creation for the sake of creation waned. Athena was drawn from these memories. A clever mind paired with clever hands, a heart of fiery passion paired with a bone-deep sense of duty. The gift given unto her was one of simple pleasures. She would find a satisfaction in fulfilling her duties that would never dull in time as his did. She would take tasks upon herself, and her heart would sing whenever she worked to complete them. Breathing in the ice-cold air for a moment, he looked to the horizon and considered his daughter's words. All around him the blasted and frozen mountains that led up to this more northerly part of Medusa. The smog was thick overhead, and even with a near-constant sun, the lands here were still dark. Halfway to the current horizon would be 1.5 kilometers then, he reasoned aloud. Turning towards the tech priest at the head of the procession, a woman clad in cybernetics that exalted her form and currently aloft upon great walking tendrils that extended from her back, he spoke. Archmagos Dominus, a servo scout if you would. At once, Lord Omnissiah. The woman returned, raising her great cob-shaped axe and summoning forth a servo skull from the procession behind her. The procession was present to harvest any potential relics from the so-called metal beast and the surroundings, and she was leader of such. The whirring servo skull flew bravely forth, rising up and beyond ridge to look beyond. They were amusing little contraptions, basic drones housed in skulls, sometimes vat-grown and sometimes harvested. There was some manner of spiritual significance to that, but he did not bother to learn of it. It was rather harmless, all things considered. Soon enough, the woman spoke out once more. There is an entity that matches the description of your lady daughter, Lord Omnissiah. It is 2.5 kilometers away. Nodding at that, he began to walk up to the edge of the ridge, looking out at the region himself. The so-called Bright Valleys, his daughter named, was only about as illuminated as dusk on Terra. It was a massive mountain valley covered in permafrost and the ruins of an old Federation-era city swallowed by the cold. Much of the buildings on the left side were collapsed and now covered in miles-wide glaciers, the reason for such visible below with active lava flows, visible through great trenches carved into the ice above. The silver worm was immediately apparent to him in the far distance, coiled up like a great snake and armor panels on its body, strangely exposed. It was resting in the exact middle of the brightest region of the now-ruined city glacier, and smooth metallic feelers reaching directly up into the sky. He narrowed his eyes at the metal beast, noting distinct similarities to something. The crunch of snow by his side brought his attention to his daughter, still clutching her metal prize, and now staring at the creature in the distance with a glare and frown. Nodding, she spoke. "That silverworm. If you can kill it, then you're my father." He nodded in turn and waved a hand to indicate it was safe to approach. A handful of his custodians came up, as did the Archmagos. This was a test for him, amusing as that was, so he began to explain his thoughts aloud. "Was it here the last time you observed it?" His daughter spoke in affirmation. "Yes." "Were the panels on its back exposed in that manner?" "Yes." He nodded. "That is one of the brightest spots in the whole of this region. It has not moved. Its armor is exposed. Its feelers are active. From this I have a suspicion that it is attempting to refill its reserves of power with sunlight collectors. Raising a claw and pointing to the head of the creature, he observed a minute detail. Look upon its head, then again at the section somewhat further down. There is a groove in the panels. Elsewhere these grooves are illuminated, but not there. This leads me to suspect that it operates without its primary motive force. How do you know that? His daughter questioned, not disagreeing with him, but testing regardless. I am an old hand at dragon slaying. He answered simply. I have slain a beast such as this before, and those grooves were as bright as a green sun then. This, in addition to its behavior, brings me to my conclusion. The silver worm currently operates on auxiliary power sources. It cannot accumulate power quickly due to the thick smog of this world. The best manner in which to slay it is persistence, to batter it at great distance until it is drained of its scant reserves and can no longer defend itself. He turned his gaze to his daughter, who was quietly observing him. I suspect that you had the same plan. Once you had fully matured, acquired sufficient armor and projectile weaponry, you would engage in a long-term hunt of the creature, slowly whittling its power reserves, chasing at a distance and harassing until it was sufficiently drained enough to slay safely. She nodded. Is that what you will do? He huffed in amusement. Nay, I do not know the limits of its reserve power. Such a hunt could take hours or months, entirely too long. He turned a grin to his daughter. I shall instead simply slay it here and now. A jet bike was one of those technologies pioneered by the nomad clans of Terra. Similar had been available in the days of the Federation, perhaps, but he was ignorant of them. They were in essence a one-man pseudo-aircraft composed of an anti-grave device, an engine, a main thruster, and some auxiliary thrusters. Dangerous, yes, but also dangerously effective when used properly. The nomad clans had been convinced to his banner several hundred years into the unification of Terra, and their learned engineers had been constructing such vehicles for his soldiers to use since. War models also carried forwards, facing weaponry, typically boat or lasguns. As part of the Great Crusade, many gifts had been given unto him by many clans, each seeking his imperial favor. One such gift was from the nomad clans, a cooperatively made jet bike for his personal use and new height. The average man's jet bike was perhaps 3 meters in scale. The larger war bikes given to his custodians, the Gryphorcan models, were perhaps 6 meters in scale. His new personal jet bike, made by their master artisans and clad in golden oromite, was as long as a knight armor was tall, 9 meters in length and humming with power. Running an armored hand across its frame, he smiled as its systems made themselves open to his mind. Its powerful engine, its mighty thrusters, its forward-mounted twin-linked las impulsor ready to fire a barrage of sundering laser fire. Such weapons were normally reserved for tanks. He had named the warbike Gringolet, named for another horse of his distant youth. Malcador sometimes commented that he needed a better naming sense, but he found that simple and effective names were usually the superior choice. Similar reasons were why he still used the same symbol he always had, the twin-headed eagle of gold. Gringolet had been a fine steed, a war horse that he dressed in red and gold livery, particularly gentle with children and rough with sorcerers. He had ridden Gringolet in the service of an ancient king with a fine-looking sword and a persuasive grin. That kingdom was gone now, torn apart by the treachery of the bastard sons of 2 entirely separate sorceresses. 2. He still grumbled to himself about that ridiculous affair at times. He pulled himself from sour memories and made Gringolet roar, engine revving and allowing him to examine its current state. Fully functional, no particular wear, weapons ready, power at full. He nodded to himself, taking stock of the weapons upon his body. Spear in right hand, sword at his belt, boat gun carried in his left hand. His lighter set of orichalcum mail covering his body, servos active and field generator lightly humming. He had left his power claw off this time, remaining in the care of one of his custodians. He would need both hands for this hunt. Rolling his shoulders atop a steed of burnished gold and red livery, he looked to his assembled audience, his daughter, his custodians, the archmagos, the procession of tech priests, and spoke. Beware of stray fire. I know not what weapons the silver worm wields. His custodians saluted. The tech priests bowed in prayer. His daughter stared in silent judgment. He grinned. Gringolet's engine roared, and off the lip of the frozen ridge he rode. The wind rushed past, his hair and cloak whipped behind him, and Gringolet fell in a nearly vertical manner. He focused his will. The great limit on how fast an object might travel was one of air resistance. Without that factor, such as in the void, objects could accelerate indefinitely. So gathering up a portion of his will, he simply cut a path through the air before his steed. Gringolet roared with joy as its path was cleared, and continued to accelerate far past what it might be able to achieve without his will to aid it. His will still interfaced with its systems. He commanded it to activate its additional thrusters. The landscape was devoured under the trample of his warbike, hundreds of meters vanishing in moments as he sped forwards towards the vast bulk of the silver worm. Gringolet's las impulsors began to fire, instantaneous beams of hot light appearing and disappearing with sharp booms of ionized air. The silver worm was barely beginning to uncoil as the first barrage of laser fire impacted its form. Immense bulk not staggering with the force, but sensors twitching in his direction and coiling shifting to face him. The beast was enormous, perhaps a kilometer in total length, and judging from the flashes of green-tinted light that appeared each time his lasers struck its hide, shielded by some manner of field generator, the weapons on the side of its central mouth glowed for a moment. He reacted at once, cutting a path to the side and leveraging his will over Gringolet to turn almost in an instant. Like a massive golden hare, Gringolet changed direction, forcing him to reach out with one armored leg and stomp against the ice to prevent himself from tipping over entirely. The groove of shattered glacier his boot left on the surface was not as wide as the groove left by the twin beams of emerald that the silver worm unleashed, nor as smooth. Some manner of disintegration, weapon similar to the Adrathic weapons of Terra. He grunted, remembering those unstable nightmare things and all the trouble they caused him. A tunnel in the surface of the ice nearly 100 meters long, left by a single devastating moment of the weapons on either side of the silver worm's mouth. Best to not be struck by such a weapon, then. Gringolet straightened out as he continued to sail to the side, the silver worm beginning to track him unerringly. Lifting his boot off the ice, he aimed his bolt gun and fired off a shot. Just as with Gringolet, he carved a path through the air for his rocket-propelled bullet to travel through. Being selective about how he cut through the air allowed him great mobility in how Gringolet moved. The next beams of emerald green were avoided by shaving an upwards path and making Gringolet leap off a ramp of thicker air. The bright green sundered a bold trench into the surface of the glacier. Gringolet descended to its standard height again as he continued to race forwards. In the distance, a moment later, his bolt landed upon the side of the worm's face, a great explosion, visible even from a distance. Yet again, the shield he couldn't observe before the moment of impact flared to life, and pale green prevented any damage to the creature. He would need to discern the mechanism behind its shielding to inflict proper damage, else he would simply be wasting ammunition. His bolt gun only had 11 shots remaining. He grinned. This would be a far simpler matter than the last time. He fired 2 more shots but carved the paths through the air in reverse order. 9 shots remaining. Emerald beams were avoided with another heavy-handed change in direction, air carved and boot smashing into the relatively delicate ice. His path changed, now heading directly for the silver worm again. 2 explosions burst to life, bullets hitting simultaneously against the side of the creature. Pale green shielding force flared to life at the point of impact. In that moment, he commanded Gringolet to unleash a barrage of laser fire. Beams of instantaneous light sliced through the air and crashed against the lower body of the immense creature. The beams of the barrage crashed against unshielded armor for a moment, some seemingly to disappear entirely instead, before it was covered by the pale green once more and protected from further harm. The shield had difficulty when dealing with multiple simultaneous strikes on different sections of the body. An energy-saving function most likely. The last worm had a constant shield about its form. The armor panels at the section he had struck were warped and discolored, slowly beginning to correct itself. An automatic repair function, yet more energy he was forcing it to waste. He forced Gringolet to the side once more, avoiding another barrage of emerald green. At this, the silver worm began to move its colossal bulk, 1,000 legs beginning to revolve and sending it forwards. A great leviathan of metal rearing up and forwards into a dive. It wasn't aiming for him, though, but the ground. He narrowed his eyes as its head crashed into the ice and passed right through without disruption, a green halo heralding its descent into the glacier below. He steered Gringolet to aim at the body as it descended, firing off yet more laser fire and crashing against pale green shielding. He passed over the site of its burrowing just as the tail disappeared into the ice below him. The ice was undisturbed, indicative of some manner of phase shifting to allow it to pass through matter undisturbed. Yet another layer of protection he would have to deal with. 3 in total so far, 2 of which clearly required energy to maintain, and a third, the armor itself, required energy to repair. Considering the weapons it had been firing upon him, his earlier estimate was correct. Its reserves of power must be incredibly vast. They were, however, not unlimited. He raced across the plains of ice and counted the moments. The creature was currently hidden from view beneath the glacier. The most tactically sound option it would take would be to angle itself to aim at him from below and fire its main weapons when under him. He forced a heavy-handed turn yet again, boot carving an immense channel in the ice and sending him racing to the side, straight towards one of the few tower-like structures of the old city still remaining. Cutting the angle of the air before him, Gringolet ascended up the side of the immense pillar and well away from the glacier ground below. This gave him a better angle to view the ice, something required, as the glacier tinted soft green. He cut a new angle, forcing Gringolet off the tower in an instant, just in time for the twin rays of disintegration to slice the icy pillar in twain. Gringolet's engine roared as he raced through the air now, pushing off the sides and tops of towers and steering through, carving his intended path through the winds. He simply had to wait for it to emerge again, nothing much else to be done for the moment. Every moment it decided to remain under the ice and fire at him was yet more energy he was forcing it to waste. Each time the glacier glowed pale green, he forced a new angle in the air and turned in ways jet bikes simply were not capable of on their own, often smashing himself into walls of recurrent air resistance. He was certain his flesh was getting bruised. Beams of annihilation bored a dozen holes in the glacier ice and cut their way through the tops of a dozen more towers of ice and Federation stone. It was good. Medusa was so dark, the glow was far easier to spot in this dimness. He grinned as the silver worm slowly emerged from the glacier, perhaps 2 kilometers away from his current position. It was enormous, so it was quite easy to spot from his current place in the sky. Changing his angle of flight once more, he descended down the side of an icy pillar in approach. Straightening out in a hard break against the floor of the glacier and racing forwards, he kept a consistent barrage of laser fire booming out. The silver worm changed its tactics, directly approaching now and occasionally sending forth beams of emerald light. Now that he was head-on, it was rather easy to avoid through specific tunneling in the air and commands issued to Gringolet. Weaving through lances of destruction on approach, the head was consistently shielded by pale green. Only on rare occasions did his laser shots breach the field, most of which passed directly through the beast and crashed into icy mountains in the distance, and some of which crashed into plates of silvery armor. Said plates of silvery armor warping and distorting, but then slowly putting themselves into order afterwards. 3 entirely separate layers of protection acting in unison to render the massive lass impulsors normally used to destroy tanks and buildings almost ineffective against it. A formidable defense. He was quite impressed by it. Gringolet roars forwards hundreds of meters past in moments. The silver worm met his challenge with a charge of its own, 1,000 limbs digging into the ice and hauling its immensity forwards. He adjusted his position on Gringolet and his grip on his spear. The twin weapons on the silver worm's head glowed. He jumped. Mind still connected to Gringolet, he commanded it to turn away. Twin beams passed through the air where he and Gringolet would have been. He soared forwards and up, raising his bolt gun to fire thrice upon distant sections of the beast's body, carving a path for the bullets to travel through. 6 bullets left. It raised its head to follow him. He hurled his spear at its underbelly, yet another path carved through the air. The force of his throw halted his momentum in part. The silver worm's weapons glowed green. He grinned. His hand caught Gringolet's side as it passed through the air in front of the silver worm, carrying him out of the path of the twin beams with great strain on his arm. It had been simple to command it to circle around to pick him up again. His bullets crashed into the far section of its body in fiery blossoms. Pale green formed to protect it. At the same moment, his spear crashed into its midsection. The spear was one of two he had wrought during the Unification Wars. The other had been given to Valdor. He had given this spear a name for a particular spear he had known in his youth, one wielded by a rather obnoxious sorcerer king he had been acquainted with, Gungnir. A tremendous boom heralded a newborn sun bursting to life against the underbelly of the silver worm. Unlike all other attacks he had landed thus far, this one forced it to stagger back. Righting himself upon the saddle of Gringolet once more, he raised his hand and focused upon the specific Psytech beacon in the distance. Once located, he carved a path. A few moments later, his spear raced back to his hand, called by his will and a lack of air resistance. He forced Gringolet to twist into another sharp turn, avoiding yet another set of annihilation beams, and firing upon the silver worm as the mist of melted ice surrounding it began to clear. A significant chunk of its midsection was simply gone now, although the silver frame was bubbling and attempting to repair itself with each passing moment. If he waited long enough, it would be entirely corrected. He had little intention of waiting. The shielding had trouble with simultaneous blows, the phasing was on a specific interval, the armor was not insurmountable, the self-repair was slow. The riddles of its defenses were known to him now. Its defeat was inevitable. It's a shame it wasn't making any noise. The roars from such a beast would be wonderful to hear. Still, if he wanted to defeat it quickly, he would need to inflict yet another simultaneous blow. No, 2 more simultaneous blows, 4 in total, just to be safe. He focused on avoiding more emerald beams for a time, pondering on how best to approach such a task. Eventually, a plan crystallized in his mind, and he nodded to himself. Forcing another near-impossible turn with Gringolet, he swerved to avoid yet another set of emerald lights and began to race forwards and then down the side of an immense canyon in the ice. He'd need height for this. Down into the icy gorge he went, the silver worm above, shifting to follow with manifold legs and heat increasing with each passing moment. Forcing another turn correction, feet trailing against the molten stone at the bottom, he began to ascend the side of the canyon and straight up. The 1,000 eyes of the silver worm glared down at him as he raced upwards, swerving around emerald lances as they attempted to annihilate him. Readying his spear for a throw, the worm reacted, immediately moving back and away. This was, of course, a diversion. Gringolet roared as it carried him high into the air, screaming as it and his will cut a path through the air. Adjusting his legs, he leapt upwards and commanded Gringolet to turn away. He floated up for a few more moments, feeling the wind race against his hair before slowing his descent with another exertion of his psychic power. Turning his head down, he locked gazes with the immense silver worm. It glared hatefully at his relatively tiny form. He grinned in gigantic mirth and raised his bolt pistol. 6 shots against the bulk of the creature. It would take them some time to land. Now exhausted of ammunition, he set his handgun against his thigh and let the magnets hold it in place. His spear was still adjusted for throwing. He readied himself for the precise moment and allowed himself to fall quickly again. It aimed its head at him more squarely. Gringolet completed its wide turn, and weapons glowed in preparation. His bullets approached its body. The weapons on the side of its head began to glow green. He reached his mind out, far into the sky above him, and searched for a particular connection. Twin beams of emerald annihilation carved a path through the atmosphere above the kilometer-long silver worm. Archaeotech lightning took hold of his form, and in a boom of thunder he was many meters to the right. Disintegration rays passed through where he used to be. He threw his spear straight down as a bolt of golden lightning. That was 3 blows. The worm began to shift, doing its best to avoid the hurled weapon. His grin escalated into laughter. His connection with the Imperial teleportation array was still active. He reached down for his last weapon. In another flash of Archaeotech lightning, he vanished. His golden boots crashed into the spiny back of the silvery worm. It immediately began a massive convulsion in an attempt to twist away. His bullets crashed against its midsection hundreds of meters away. Pale green protected it. His hands grabbed hold of his sword's hilt. Gringolet's laser fire crashed into its underbelly. Pale green flickered against the new threat. His hands drew his blade. Gungnir crashed down against its head. Pale green flickered and died against a newborn star. His hands swung his blade. His grin escalated into booming laughter. He poured the sum total of his will into his blade. Its systems caused it to ignite in blinding white flame. It crashed against the weakened section in its center, where his spear had hit earlier. The Lands of Shadow, a fearsome and frigid place where metal-fleshed monsters roamed and ghosts wailed, bore witness to a tsunami of golden white flame. The death throes of the greatest monster upon the world, called Medusa. And with this city-wide wave of psychic flame came the booming laughter of an ancient warrior, carried up and across the mountains by gigantic lungs, heard and witnessed by an awestruck delegation of machine ministers, golden-clad demigods, and a young woman with light brown eyes. For he was quite the old hand at dragon-slaying. His daughters were getting along well with each other. Lofton, Hathor, and Athena had formed a sort of trio, mostly bound through constant spars among themselves. Fulgrim had taken it upon herself to watch over Danu and Madonna, forming the second trio within the wider set. Lucem himself had decided to start taking his naps alongside Atalanta, the youngest, and thus, theoretically, most vulnerable. He was still reluctant to ever speak, except to ask about the next deployment, but this was a good start for the boy. He let his gaze roam the ruined courtyard. Limestone turned partially into slag and glass. Whatever symbols once here burned away, piles of melted autogun shots and scraps of destroyed equipment. But rarely were there any corpses, most of which burned away or scavenged, bones removed with precision. Piles of ash in corners where the whipping desert winds could not reach them. Athena spent much of her time with Danu and Fulgrim, speaking on matters of engineering and construction, a shared interest of the three. Lofton spent much of her time with Madonna, specifically to tease her in the way elder siblings ought to do with their younger ones, and in challenges of coming up with increasingly elaborate boasts and insults. Hathor did her best to make time for all of her sisters, Atalanta especially. Atalanta, of course, was still in her infancy and acted as infants usually did. Lucem spent all of his time slumbering, although now he slumbered near his sisters. He let his stride take him up and over the ruined tower, the crumbled stone of which served as an adequate walkway for him to go up to the next terrace of the fortress courtyard. Just as before, filled with scorch marks, slagged stonework, melted metal scraps, and symbols turned to ash. Bodies empty of bones and meat, just scraps of equipment. He breathed in deeply, tasting the scent that lingered in this place, the sunfire of certainty. Their studies were going well from last he heard from Aristocles. The sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics were all more than acceptable in pace, although some took to the core fields better than others. Language, histories, governance, warfare were in a similar situation, some of his daughters taking to the subjects better than others. Psychery was possibly their most disparate field, but it was still within acceptable parameters. Few of his daughters were particularly enthusiastic to learn, although each saw benefits in specific uses. Madonna took to those lessons with immense gusto, devouring all she could, only halted in certain fields by his specific and absolute warnings. Some things no man should delve into. Communion with the horrors was one subject that he would be gladdened to eradicate entirely. They were told that predators lurk in the warp, and that they should never attempt any action save their utter destruction. Not allies, not creatures to tame, parasites and predators. His comparison to the creatures that sucked on the souls of sorcerers on Prospero caused a grave look to come over Madonna's normally unreachable mask of confidence. His custodians and Psychana, moving in pairs, returned from their perimeter searches, each shaking their heads minutely in turn as they came within his gaze. His contemplative frown remained on his face as he considered the situation in full. This planet was Colchis. He had remembered reading articles of its discovery and colonization. Strange edifices scattered about a rather unremarkably bare planet, indications of ancient Xenos life, but little factual could be drawn up about their purpose. Last he remembered hearing about it was some time before the Machine Rebellion, and the information given to him by his supposed son told him little of particular concern. Information of what he knew of the world in the history line that he returned from. Not much save that it was eventually destroyed. Colchis wasn't quite destroyed, he thought, as he stepped over slag and ashes, but it could be in a generation or two. This was the last proper city on the planet. The rest of the inhabitants living in scattered tribes and nomadic clans, wandering about the planet from oasis to oasis. Considering the already barren natural wealth on the planet, and scraps of once functioning technologies now turned to ash, the people here were doomed to die on the planet without much hope of escaping into the void. His daughter, 17, primarch of the Imperial Heralds, was supposed to be on this planet. She was not. He supposed that this confirmed Malum's letter in part. He did claim that he intended to retrieve 17. He didn't say what he apparently decided to do to the population. The Emperor estimated that perhaps a third of the population was slain over the course of one day. He walked over to the origin point for a cone of slag on the stone ground before drawing his sword and going through the motions of a swing. He imagined a cone of flame coming from his blade, furrowed his brow, and bent his knees slightly. Not letting his arm fully extend, he mimed another swing. It didn't quite line up, but it was good enough for an estimate. 3 1/3 meters or so. His son was on the tall side, good for warring. He let his gaze trail to each spot of flame, not covering all the angles that defenders might fire down from. His son had a small ranger force with him, and judging from the ruined towers, at least one war walker of some variant. Assuming he wasn't rotating his troops, that would be very few to conduct such a lengthy purge as this, especially with how soon each city was ruined after one another. Multiple ships, or rapid transportation, or both. In addition to a small force of highly elite warriors to accompany him. The occasional grooves and scratches in the stonework told him that many were mounted on some sort of clawed beast of roughly similar scale to a light tank. These were the Eldar, then? He did not know them to use clawed steeds, although perhaps the Exodites were different. His son was wielding a psychic flame similar to his own. He wondered how well he taught the boy, or if it was simply engineered into him. The sword scale was comparable. He furrowed his brow before adjusting his grip and swinging his sword again, wielding the blade as if it were larger than it was compared to his frame. This time the cone of slag lined up much better. It was not a similarly sized sword then. It was a near-perfect match, perhaps even the same blade. It was not his best work, certainly not a primary arm, but it was a perfectly serviceable sidearm. Perhaps he gave the blade to the boy as a gift. In the once future history, it would make sense. He turned his gaze and looked out of the courtyard towards what should have been a large port city. Only piles of rubble and dunes greeted his gaze. His probable son, wielding a similar sword to himself, took a small army of veteran soldiers mounted on clawed creatures and a war walker with a blade, and had marched on each city on this world. Each one was carefully destroyed of any banners and insignias before being bombarded. This process was repeated for each and every major city along the waterways of the world, indicating rapid transports or multiple ships. No, his probable son was present at each. Rapid transport was required then. The more important question was why. He breathed in again, letting the nostalgic scent of sunfire ash fill his lungs once more, and exhaling. For some reason, his probable son decided that this world needed to be raised after retrieving 17. The number of possible reasons were endless. He had yet to take measure of the boy. He knew not how or what he thought. Malum Kaido indicated a particular personality, however. His probable son had decided that this world needed to be punished, possibly destroyed. The question was, does he trust the judgment? This world was still useful. Breathable atmosphere, abundant sea life, existing population, potential treasures in the city scraps, land to build upon. It was currently of very little use, however. Mostly barren waste and feudal populations, and now with utterly destroyed urban centers and no existing infrastructure of note. It would be a relatively expensive endeavor to bring this world to standards high enough to start effectively contributing to the wider Imperium. Pragmatically, he lost little by writing off the loss of this world, but that would mean deciding to put conscious trust in the decision, the judgment of a man he had not met. This was not a matter of tax law. This was a declaration of worldwide death, a scouring, a lashing, a punishment from the void above. Even if it was pragmatic, writing this world off would mean endorsing a sentencing that he did not know the crime of, only the punishment. He let his gaze wander the horizon, the barren wastes and sands, the burning mirages and flickering air, the ash and slag of a scouring. In the ashes of 1,000,000 or more dead, he found his answer. Custodians, return to the Bucephalus and tell them to ready the virus bombardment. Psychana, return to your idler duties. The sentence of planetary execution came easily from his lips. I sentence the planet Colchis to exterminatus extremis. He would trust the justice of his probable son and finish the boy's work here. He could live with the sin, should this prove to be the incorrect decision. The boy had earned this much faith at least. Idly he made a note to check up on his daughters before they began preparations for another warp jump. He wouldn't be able to get off that blasted throne after they began, and it was a long ways to Barbarus. From the archaeotech cannons that lined the ribs of Bucephalus, Midas' ship of the Imperium of Mankind, a series of grand and terrible weapons issued forth. They launched without sound, for all is silent in the void, and approached the barren and ravaged world named Colchis. Reaching the atmosphere, the shells around the deadly payload began to burn up, ablating under the friction of re-entry and slowly beginning to enter onto their next stages of deployment. Soon, the shells had been sufficiently ablated to automatically deploy the second and third stage measures, slowing down the missiles gradually and bringing them to an almost gentle fall over the world. Once their internal cogitators had recorded that the missiles had been sufficiently slowed, it began to unleash the payload into the atmosphere. The Life-Eater virus was, in truth, barely a virus at all. It acted as such, certainly, propagating by digging into cell structures, devouring the innards, reproducing rapidly enough to burst out, carried by wind or water or land to the next host, and repeating the process. It performed all the expected functions of a deadly virus. It was, in truth, a weapon of the age of technology, one used to wipe planets clean of all previous life and leave a sea of ash in its wake. The Life-Eater virus propagated over Colchis, covering the scant life and immediately beginning this process. Organic matter, wherever it was found on the surface, quickly began to break down and dissolve into primordial matter, undifferentiated organic mass composed of naught but the stuff that composes cells. This breakdown of organic matter beginning to release a highly flammable gas byproduct, which rapidly began to take up a fraction of the world's atmosphere. With good winds, the virus can propagate over an entire world in less than an hour. A wave of foul air turning all living things into an ocean of destroyed cellular matter. With poor wind conditions, the virus may take a week to finish this process. The original missiles took measure of the winds left in the wake of their initial bombardment, tasting it, cogitators on board, estimating the fraction of air that was now composed of the gas byproduct. Once the atmosphere reached an acceptable threshold, the last stage of the weapon, stage 5, began. All missiles reaching consensus, a secondary weapon was enabled in their cores. Simple meltabombs. Promptly detonating, the missiles turned into brief bonfires of white-hot chemical flames. On their own, this would mean little. With the atmosphere now containing a large fraction of highly flammable byproduct for the semi-organic decay, these bonfires were merely the spark to light the pre-established chemical fuse. The byproduct was immensely hot when it started to burn, especially so when it was accumulated in great enough amounts. Hot enough indeed to begin a chain reaction in the other gases native to the atmospheres of all standard inhabitable worlds. From an initial bombardment of 1,000 scattered missiles over the surface of Colchis, a wave of burning sky washed forth. Not that any of the millions of inhabitants were alive still to see it at this point, reduced as they were to organic sea. A tidal wave of heat and pressure unlike any Colchis had witnessed prior, burning the highest layers of its oceans into steam. In time, that steam would form rain, which would begin the natural process of healing the planet afterwards. The planet now reduced to bare, nearly volcanic rock and seas. All but the deepest parts of the world were utterly consumed by the virus bombardment and then burned to ash, left to be washed away by rain. In ideal deployments of the weapon, the atmosphere was also ravaged to temporary uninhabitability. Rock and water were all that remained of Colchis after a period of 2 days. A successful virus bombardment was logged into the records of the Bucephalus. Ghosts swarmed Colchis, the now dead world. They covered it in the layer of immaterium, in the warp surround and covering materium, the shell of psychic awareness that encompassed all things. The ghosts crawled in the outer, most shallow layers of the psychic realm. One by one, these ghosts were dragged into the deeper warp, nothing for them to cling to in the shallows now that Colchis had been executed, pulled in by the writhing narratives and twisting songs from more distant worlds. A riptide of thought that brought spirits into swarming corals. These corals of warp were inhabited by predators. Swarming creatures of thought, energy, and narrative, stirred into a frenzy by the injection of so many fresh souls, and now eagerly devouring everything they came across. A bloodbath of ghosts and the things that dwelt in the warp just beyond the shallows. These warp predators were the least of all such things in the immaterium. They did not approach higher-order consumers and fled at the scent of such creatures in their presence, hoping to hide their existences beneath and behind long, ossified narratives and songs near to them. In the deeper warp, just beyond the corals, directly above Colchis, sat a higher-order entity, a fragment of something far grander and more terrible than what any mere warp predator could assume the forms of. Living maelstroms of thought energy and long fossilized narratives that encompass such vast swathes of the warp that they ceased to be entities and instead became part of the ocean itself. 4 grand seas that compose the immaterium ocean of the local galaxy. Each an ecosystem in its own right, each propagating in the manner all life was bound to consume and grow. These seas were named the Chaos Gods. The entity was a fragment of one such god-sea, a being that composed a small part of the greater whole, bound to and a part of its ecosystem, a daemon. The daemon was sitting in place, legs crossed in the manner of wise men, unbothered by the swirls of narratives about it and focused on the world below. Its body was of a smokeless flame, and 6 arms extended from it. One set of arms was clasped in prayer to its greater whole, one set gently pressing stray souls into wax seals and closing papyrus scrolls with their yoke, and the last set busy with quill in hand and recording what the 3 heads bore witness to. The heads looked in all 3 directions, each with 3 eyes and each face covered by a veil of silks and bronze. One face was young, one face mature, the last old, and over the heads was a halo of 60 fiery rods gently revolving about. About it were the winds of whispered truths and the scrolls of history unvarnished, and this was the domain the daemon brought about it. This daemon was a prince and a presence, one of the manifold clerks of the Lord of Change, who made it their business to record the fates of worlds. Currently, he was writing a special report on what had occurred here. Orders from a higher position in the bureaucracy of fate, one which he followed dutifully. A simple copy of his regular reporting. The scribe did his best to ignore the distant weeping, annoying creatures. He did not pause in his record-keeping, but his attention was caught by the approach of another entity in the warp, more than a mere warp predator, a coursing beast, bounding on 4 immense and thickly muscled legs, eyes that burned a smoky flame and claws that shed blood with their tread. The head of the beast was hairless, immense, and thickly muscled jaws filled with savage teeth and gently carrying a number of long bones. Behind the head was a crest of horn and frill which were tattered and frayed, and a thick pelt of metal hairs. One of the many messenger dogs of the Red God who ferried the words of commandment carved on bone on the behalf of daemon lords. Each pawprint brought with it a trail of brimstone and brass, and this was the domain the daemon brought with it. The beast raced up to the scribe, slowing in its bouncing pace as it neared, before stopping a distance away and sitting back on its laurels. Growling through the thin bones it delicately carried, the beast began to speak in the language of daemons, enuncia, scribe. The scribe acknowledged the beast with all appropriate courtesies. Carrier Hound, prince of coursing beasts of the line of Karanak. You are before a scribe of Zainch. On what business? The carrier hound exhaled, and fumes of burning air escaped its nostrils. A report of what occurred here. You will provide a copy to me. My lord demands it. Your lord is not my lord. The scribe spoke simply, not pausing in its duties, even as the carrier hound prepared to pounce and maul. But my lord has foreseen this. I inscribe the report as I speak. The carrier hound returned to its haunches, glaring balefully at the scribe as he worked. Lips drawn back over the thin bones, thin and delicate etchings of words could be seen covering their surface, part of the daemon's own duties. Hurry then, scribe. The hound snarled out, bloodlust restrained by duty alone. In the ambient wails of the warp, the two daemons sat, one in furious waiting, the other in deliberate and articulate record-keeping. The weeping grew closer, and both daemons reacted. The carrier hound, in another snarl of fury, and the scribe in faintest hopes that the particular fate it was foreseeing did not come to pass. But the fate did come to pass, and it was a most unfortunate one. A form of living flesh and flora came stumbling up to the two daemons present. Like all of its kind, it was plump and sodden and wretched to behold. Hair fell down as damp vines and branches, crowned by a vibrant and blooming garland. Eyes were watery and narrowed in sorrow, and tears trailed down her face. A black dress clung to her form, wet with blood and bile, and in her arms she carried a swaddled babe. But no matter how she pressed the babe against her breast, it would not begin to drink, for the babe's eyes were milky, and the swaddling was heavy with yellow corpse wax. A mantle of fungus grew from the child's head and her shoulders. A corpse, unable to be blessed by living infection, and a most miserly thing to behold. A weeping sister, a daughter of the father of flies, who mourned for all those lost to dreadful death, who would never again feel the blessing of wondrous life coursing through their veins and innards and about their skin. She stumbled forth in despair, but the child is not what she wept for. Each step brought with it the life that fed on death, and the cold, wet rot that it thrived within. And such was the domain the daemon brought with her. In near hysterics, she cried out, "All gone! All gone. The children of Cultus are dead and remain dead. Do you not see the tragedy?" The carrier hound growled but did not respond, having little patience for the cries. The scribe, provoked by the endless weeping he had already been forced to endure, saw an opportunity to shoo away a nuisance. The destiny of this world is of no great concern. All is within the accountings of fate. At this the hound snarled again. Within the accountings. A most critical pawn is dead, and you declare it within the accountings. The plans of your lord are crumbling. The scribe hummed, a sour note which wove souls into wax. Ever crumbling, ever growing. The plans of my lord are endless, and account for all things. Your lord understands this, I should hope. My lord is beginning to understand how useless his fellows are at waging war. This supposed alliance is a waste of our armies. The carrier hound paced back and forth in fury, flames catching about its tread and flaring briefly. It is not a war, the weeping sister wailed out. Collapsing to her knees and squeezing the swaddled corpse, she continued, "It is salvation, saving them from death with the blessings of my lord." Not causing it, the scribe dipped his quill in the ink of black ambitions once more and continued to write as he replied, "It is neither. It is neither. War implies equal foes. Salvation implies a stagnate outcome. It is a leashing of their paths and actions. Surely you understand the taming of beasts, carrier hound? Surely you understand the desire to change their fated deaths, weeping sister? Have faith. All is within the accountings of my lord. I fail to see how, in truth, the performance of your lord has been most lacking thus far." A critique carried on the winds, and all three daemons noticed at once, only after the words had been declared. A figure dressed in fine but simple wear emerged from the misty warp winds. The figure was dressed in black with hints of gold in his buckles and bracelets. His face was hidden behind a veil of ambiguity, perfectly plain and indistinguishable in a crowd of many unrecognizable among a host of others. He held to the reins of two other daemons, lesser in status to he, and tormented with piercings in their flesh and rods in their orifices. These smooth-skinned daemons were clad in unremarkable garments, and they were tied to an unrecognizable carriage upon which the figure who called out rode upon. The carriage was burdened with luggage and tools, all the things required for theatres to perform, and its wheels turned in any direction without road or track. A master of ceremonies, an arranger of affairs required for the performances of others, labouring plainly and without bringing attention to himself for his prince of pleasures. About him was the scent of spice and the waft of perfume, and such was the domain the demon brought with him. At his sight, the carrier-hound growled, the weeping sister despaired, and the scribe of Tzeentch hoped he would leave immediately. The master of ceremonies gave a charming smile before continuing his words. Of course, no offence meant. It's natural to have mistakes pile up without competent staffing. Still, I'd say the current plans are quite impossible to go ahead with. An emergency alteration is required. The hound growled out, furious that he was in agreement with the newcomer, Daemon. The time allocated to the godlings of the anathema has been a waste. That stratagem is too wasteful to recover at this point. New prey must be located. The scribe nodded in agreement, happy that his fellows were able to see the benefits in change. A path had already been charted for this scenario. New plans are already drafted and are being distributed as we speak. I predict that your lords will be quite pleased with them. The weeping sister wailed again. The godlings are lost, given up on. Poor babes, abandoned by the blessings. Will we not go to save them? The carrier-hound snarled at the uselessness. The scribe of Tzeentch sighed, having seen this outcome. The master of ceremonies gave a polite smile to conceal his amusement. Nodding, the master of ceremonies whipped his reins once, causing the lesser daemons to writhe and jolt in delighted sensation. I'd only come by to greet my fellows. I'll need to get a move on to get things ready for the next stage, as my fellow masters of ceremonies are likely already working on, you understand? The scribe nodded as he handed off the finished scroll to the carrier-hound. The carrier-hound, showing much restraint, delicately took the message with his teeth. The scroll was clutched in the mouth, already full of bones, looking quite out of place. Snarling and immediately bounding off, the carrier-hound was soon out of sight. With a jaunty wave, the master of ceremonies faded into the warp beyond as well, leaving the scribe of Tzeentch and the weeping sister. He hoped she would go away. She kept wailing miserly, utterly bent on not changing her spot. He made a note to petition his lord for a change in position. In the most ancient histories of mankind, wars often lasted decades or generations with indecisive outcomes. Old grudges that linger in bloodlines and shape a nation for many years to follow. This was the form of war his old friend was most familiar with. With the onward pace of technology, war shifted its nature into one of rapid and total annihilation of the enemy. He who strikes first will win without question, provided the strike is powerful and devastating enough. The nations that can deploy their war assets quickest can choose what locations become battlefields, and if they deploy enough firepower, they can ensure victory before the enemy is able to muster their defenses properly. The advent of void travel added yet another dimension to warfare, that being one of orbital supremacy. Nations that were locked to planets were at the mercy of nations capable of sailing the stars. There was no contest. Nations without ships of sufficient offensive power were at the mercy of nations with such ships. Warships were the single most important military asset in the age of void travel. Without warships, nations were theory. With warships, nations were fact. Every world in local space incapable of producing warships could be brought into the fold of the Imperium with a single ship capable of basic artillery strikes. No ruler worth integrating would refuse to join a greater nation with such generous terms if the other option was the destruction of his cities. One hand with friendship, the other with death, and the choice was theirs. Most were of at least middling intellect and recognized the benefits to joining. The rest joined only after a single city was destroyed. Thanks to the so far accurate information of subject Malum Kaido, all worlds without orbital capacity in their nearby systems had been integrated and were now hard at work setting up all the industrial capacity the burgeoning Imperium would require. The primary wealth of these systems? Water and metal. Water for Terra. Metal to bring more and more of the defunct and ravaged ships located and brought back to the Jovian shipyards back to full operational capacity. This was well ahead of their predicted scheduling. Incredibly good fortune. He didn't trust it. Metal was simpler. He grunted as he tapped his staff on the ground before him, the custodians before him, pushing open the heavy adamantium plates and allowing him to pass. His current escort had entirely too many thoughts dedicated to what he thought were clever rhymes. Annoying beyond belief. He kept moving deeping into the compound, ignoring each dimly lit doorway that led into a subchamber, the vast majority of which were filled with cogitators and data files, enough to fill warehouses entered each day, and that same number left each day. The most efficient an Imperium-wide central bureaucracy could be at the moment. This compound, built into one of the smaller mountains adjacent to the primary fortress of the Astronomicon, was the current headquarters of the Adeptus Administratum, central governing body of the fledgling Imperium. Its systems of organizing information were designed to become increasingly efficient at larger and larger scales, a requirement to prevent needing to transfer within the first 100 years of the Imperium's creation. The galaxy was a large place, and the paperwork required to properly regulate a galaxy was enormous. Even stripped down, as their system was, it was still a centralized system. Presently they took up a fraction of the mountain facility in overall volume. The overall facility, starting from the peak and going down to the historically attested sea level, essentially hollowed out the immensity of the Grand Rock. Many of the more permanent buildings on Terra had to be designed in this manner, habitation chambers under the bulwark of many feet of protective rock. The surface was still too passively hazardous for permanent habitation yet. That would change as they brought more water back to Terra. His old bones creaked in irritating manners as he continued deeper into the facility, passing row after row of doorways into side chambers currently abrim with orderlies and agents of the mass-recruited Administratum. Just about everyone who could read and write not busy with other tasks were brought to a facility, trained for a week in their new duties and given quotas to fulfill. There was no time to micromanage their labors yet, not on his end at the very least. They were given a small boon. That book from the subject, Malum Caedo, Codex Administratum. It contained little Malcador did not already know, but even then nuggets of wisdom were found within the document, which he pilfered without shame. The true value of the tome was in how expertly it managed to simplify and explain the nuances of running a most efficient system for the layman reader. It was carefully edited to remove more potentially problematic passages, then copied en masse, then handed out to each and every member of the administratum. The aforementioned passages were preserved and accessible with the appropriate paperwork fulfilled beforehand. Not technically forbidden, but adding a single layer of effort required to access the information was often more than enough to prevent the vast majority of humans from ever laying eyes upon it. Humans were slothful creatures that way. The Codex was a great boon, as was the simple tome of current languages. The last Codex was far more concerning, as it was useful, as it was infuriating that he knew the great ape didn't bother to read it before he left. Yes, the language is very dry and technical. No, that does not give you an excuse, you overgrown barbarian monkey. This was information on the great enemy, and you, Malcador's free hand curled in fury, and he ground his teeth as he kept walking. The Imperium would crumble in a day if all its citizens knew how absent-minded their emperor was at times. It was all he could do to ensure it ran smoothly in the cracks left by his friend's ham-fisted approach to life. Fortunately, his friend had listened to him more often than not and had produced at least one agent that he could rely upon. He reached a door. It was not the final door in the row, nor was it a door of particular note. It was indeed a perfectly average door, identical to all others he had passed before. Door number 180. He knocked against it twice, leaving exactly 1/4 second between each knock, looking to the world at large as if he had simply rapped it impatiently. A hidden camera in the upper vents behind his head was looked through. A mind slowly touched his. He returned the gesture with the sending of a specific memory, the image of a two-headed snake. He grunted as the door was opened and he entered into the unassuming chamber. Inside was a room like many others. Rows of cogitators, stacks of data files, wires connecting to power lines and broadcasting ports, and a single haggard-looking individual inside. A woman with shock-white hair that hung over where one eye should be. The woman in the same unassuming brown robes of any member of the Administratum, and currently staring at him with her single turquoise eye. The most notable features were her lack of scars and the fact that she was 8 feet tall. To those who knew more than surface-level observation could bring, she was also exactly 10 years old. Officially, she did not exist. Unofficially, she was the 20th primarch, created by the Emperor of Mankind, left in his care to raise and tutor as his wild friend crusaded across the stars to retrieve the others. He deliberately did not think of her name. Her last test to prove she had mastered intrusive telepathy was to pry it from his thoughts without his notice. Lord of Terra. She respectfully ground out, irritation carefully hidden behind a blank gaze. She nursed no small amount of resentment for him, something he had deliberately instilled. Should the day come that he himself becomes a threat to the Imperium, she wouldn't hesitate to act due to emotional bonds, not like he did. She did not like him. That was safer for the Imperium at large. He needed more checks to his power than just his friend, and she would serve that role more than adequately. A new task for you, Agent 20. He grumbled, stumbling forwards and pulling a data slate from his inner robes. She visibly twitched in fury, gesturing wildly at the many slates already around her. He sneered in disdain. She had a tremendously poor habit of attempting to do too much herself. She needed to learn to actually use her agents more effectively. You have officers for a reason, girl. Delegate? This takes higher priority. She hissed as she took the data slate from his withered hands, noticing the slight twitching in his hands. Quickly scanning through the document, she jerked her head up and snarled in panic and fury. Again. Why wasn't I informed? He gave her a withering look, and she swallowed, grimacing, as she realized that her likely reaction was indeed the reason. She quickly got back to reading over the document, stress in her mind escalating with each passing line. The stockpile of 3rd Legion geniseed, the raw genetic material required to replenish their losses, had been stolen. This was indeed the second attempted theft. The first attempted threat had been forced back with great trouble, an old daemon that had fled from his friend in years past. Of course, the things that flee from the Emperor of Mankind are often much more of a danger to everything else, including their standard forces and a young primarch. He had been overseeing a transfer of the stockpile to a more secure facility elsewhere on Luna, in the quiet and unassuming manner best used for delicate matters. Unfortunately, quiet and unassuming didn't account for giant blackened skeletons made of metal breaching all defenses in an instant and breaking his goddamn ribs before slipping away in a flash of green light. It was not an immediate issue, so long as his friend did indeed manage to retrieve Primarch 3. He could simply move the half of 3rd Legion that was still on Terra to non-frontline roles and wait for the main Imperial fleet to return. He took deep and slow breaths so as to not aggravate his barely healed bones, even with his great expertise in biomancy. Restoring ribs from powder was not something he had great amounts of experience in. Some experience, yes, not much, however. Apparently he needed to correct that little oversight when he found the time. She growled, raising the tablet up to her face and clearly resisting the urge to shatter it in her hands before setting it down again. Yet another unforeseen threat, right? Her voice was cold and sharp, expectant, still sore over him, not wanting her worried about daemons quite so early then. Troublesome girl. Yes, actually. He growled out, looming over her seated form with the bulk of his psychic might to emphasize the point. A threat that I have no profile for I did not know of it beforehand. Hence why I am here. She wrapped her fingers against her arms in thought, before grunting out. The metal description matches several records of ancient pylon architecture. There was depictions of anthropomorphic figures on those at times. There was an anthropomorphic figure that punted me through a transport ship. He shook his head briefly, ignoring the flash of pain. I'm dictating a new task for you. You will be responsible for the creation of profiles on all threats of greater than planetary scale we encounter. Do this in addition to your pet projects with the scattered cultists. Delegate everything else to your Astartes. That's what they exist for. They don't know, she began, pushing up and slamming hands on the table. His glare and exertion of psychic will stopped her in place. Her soul buckled and writhed in his grip, but his hand-shaped soul did not allow her any freedom. She began to choke. Then teach them. He let go. She almost collapsed to the floor, catching herself on her desk. Breathing deeply, she curled her hands into fists, which scored grooves in the plastic table. You should have been able to shake off that hold if you are properly rested. He drawled. You are not. I have work to do. She attempted. like looking into a mirror. You cannot be everywhere at once. You cannot do everything at once. It was a lesson that he should have learned long before he actually did. The ability to trust in others was a difficult thing to grasp, especially when your own abilities far outstripped theirs. She was quiet for a long time, glaring down and deliberately not looking at him. Eventually, she quietly spat out, "I understand." He huffed out. "Good then. Now, a final matter." He retrieved another item from his inner robes and held it out. She took a moment to look up, seeing his outstretched hand and the item it contained. A puzzled look growing on her face, she rose back to her full height and took the item, bringing it up to her face to examine closer. "A false eye?" she questioned. "Why not simply restore my old one with cloned tissue? A relic from before the age of strife." He explained simply, memories flashing as he remembered the simply decorated lockbox he had pulled the eye from. It wasn't anything more than a memento now anyways, it didn't matter. Once these optics were standard issue for cognition workers, you should find it making your labor simpler. She frowned, turning her gaze back to him. "Why wait so long to give it to me then?" She was looking for another test, or lesson. There was none this time, however. "Today is your birthday, girl," he impassively explained. She was quiet at that, turning the optic over in her fingers a few times in consideration. Slowly, she brought it up to the socket hidden behind the curtain of hair that covered that side of her face, and slipped it into space, where the Medicae had to dig the ruined orb out last time. "Does it function? Does it function?" He grunted out, "Yes." She replied with an equal grunt. It established a psi link. He nodded in confirmation before turning and opening the chamber doors again. No need for more words. She knew her duties and had been taught a new lesson. He had to get back to overseeing the training of the first batch of assassins. "Thank you," she called out plainly. He grunted before leaving the room and closing the door behind him. Girl was still too sentimental then. As he began to walk away, he considered the next matters he would need to personally oversee later on. The asteroid harvesting operations were still going strong, beginning to move onto near-Sol planetoids so as to not take too much gravitational mass from their own asteroid belt. That was the primary source of metal currently being used. Much of the closest such planetoids had already been completely devoured by cultist forgecraft to build that great big monstrosity his friend named after a horse. Atrocious naming sense. Next was the matter of arranging the unloading of the next water shipment. It would be some time before a standardized currency could be implemented, so most payments from integrated worlds to the Imperium, in exchange for the supplies needed to get their industrial bases up to standards, was in raw supplies. One of those raw supplies being water. How did that sorcerer warlord even get his hands on a vortex torpedo? It took the Emperor and him nearly half a century to close that warp rift, and now half the ocean was gone and the other half was too salty to support life. Blasted sorcerers and their ruining of everything for everyone else. He hated sorcerers. He deliberately ignored the irony of that thought as he walked through the halls of a grand mountain fortress, leaning on his arcane staff, which burned with psychic fire, wearing robes and escorted by a Gina soldier. Instead, he busied his thoughts with the much more comfortable state of internally monologuing about all the things that he had a grudge against, and why those things should be killed with prejudice. Bad enough that there were human sorcerers, or xeno-sorcerers, but now there were also apparently machine sorcerers who liked to steal cargo loads of gene seed. From what he could tell, that machine was also xeno in origin, meaning it was a xeno-machine sorcerer. All the things he hates most in a single entity. He was going to strangle it next time. Strangle it after punting it through a few ships and seeing how it liked it. He would figure out how to make the strangulation affect a machine later on, once he was in less pain. Her last memories before laying down to slumber, to rest through the troubles and be awoken at a safer time, were ones of red and white. Red for the capital, white for her, and Volish black for everything around her. Blooms of fire and sound, screams and roars, the clashing of bone blade and humming steel, torrents of warp energy and laser fire cutting through armor and flesh and kin. The greatest heroes and champions among the monkey, once allies against the Ignea, had been driven into war against the Eld. She did not know why, they did not tell her. All she knew is that the world was painted in pinkish hues. All she knew is that she could hear their roars as they feasted on sorceries and stamped on cream cities. All she knew is that their noble war cries were far more fearsome when they were aimed at elden fortresses. She was the Everqueen, however. If she did not have hope, what hope would her kin have? So she maintained the unshakable gold white as she laid down to rest, to await a new awakening. She awoke in a dimly lit chamber, the sea of souls like the heavy rock above her head, protectively curled around her slumbering form. She awoke with a little monstrosity near her, shivering, cold with hostile intent and in need of gentle warmth. She awoke with a taller godling, almost but not quite, eld in nature, soul like weathered marble, held together with bands of Asuriani gold and smouldering with Kaini red. She awoke with two of her kin, born starving and stunted, looking at her with desperate adoration. She awoke 2 or 3 Lan along the off-white road. A vision so terrible that she longed to still be in the depths of gentle slumber. Their noble pantheon devoured by a newborn calamity. Their war god, even as dreadful as he was, shattered. Their jester fled, running headlong into deep dragon lines and pulling nascent strings of Morai He. Their mother and her greater part imprisoned and tormented by the grandest perversion itself. Her people had lost her, forgotten her, and moved on. They had built wonders and terrors. They had yoked the wheel and all things therein, and slipped onto the false road of ever-escalating sensation. Blinded and ignorant of their pasts, her people had carved their annihilation and were now prey to ancient foes once more. She had wept for many weeks, a mourning tune to songcraft, a shoddy harp, and delicate fingers plucking at strings until she had shed a lake of snowflake tears, sequestering herself to unfamiliar chambers and letting her grief song paint the world and system in blue. A terrible shame came upon her after her grief song was finished, wasting a half-cycle on sorrow, forcing her kin of his age and their allies to shelter her within wings of wraiths, aided by songs of gold and red, against waves of off-green and fuchsia. She had barely the reserves to notice. She had barely the strength to offer deepest apologies. Her little kin did not allow her to, youngling warriors insistent on throwing themselves at her disposal, youngling maidens and youngling smiths doing similar. The youngling king on court at Charnax, Asan Nil. The Stonebank Lover was his name, a strange divergence from the name she once knew. He insisted that all her needs were met, and only permitted visitors once she declared herself ready for them. Clad in nostalgic pelts of beast hide, and crowned in starry bone. Months of greeting her little kin, white and grey, painting their forms as they desperately attempted to assure themselves she was real. It was much more difficult to keep faith than she ever remembered it being. But she kept it the same. She pulled herself up from her grief song and demanded the sunshine eternal over her waves. She demanded it, her soul obeyed, and her gold-white path through the dark seas was set. Truth was only what you allowed it to be. Her truth was that each day would be brighter than the previous. I apologize if the accommodations are not up to standard. The godling boy spoke, gentle smile and furrowed brows on his almost elden face. It was a little too uffish, but very close. He was clad in strange half-crook and half-eld plate, a product of the current day, and carried arms of primitive laser fire. His name was another strange corruption of word song, indicating deep wilderness, Roban Ututia, although perhaps not inaccurate. It was something she would have to get used to, all the strangeness of the names of this era. Perhaps she could practice her kennings. That would be quite lovely. The boy already had many heaped upon him by her little kin. She could add cuter ones to the pile. Avail thyself, son of warm seas. Not quite. She smiled gently, moving to step through the dragon gate and onto the godling boy's capital world. It was delightfully charming. Green rolling hills, and little folk abound, going about in industrious fashion. The primary keep was cream and adorned in banners, and the sense of life were thick here. We shan't demand the accommodations of ages past on visitation such as this. Although, she leaned in slightly, hand raised to her face to act the silver expression out, we must confess it's a little overwhelming how much our little kin attempt to give. This is still quite refreshing yet. the slightly chastised shuffling of her rainbow-cloaked guardians, pulled from the most veteran and red-armed soldiers of each and every exodite world, conveyed embarrassment on behalf of their people. They had witnessed firsthand how much she was covered in luxuries, and how little she knew how to use any of them. Godling Boy nodded in a slightly relieved manner, flanked by Littlekin Jewel, daughter, and his own personal guard. She had heard them referred to as Star Victors and Thundering, warriors both, although she had been told neither were quite accurate. Broad-shouldered in ways that Eld were never more similar in stance to the proud monkey or croc of old, clad in wise bronzes and fiery reds, they certainly made entertainingly crass songs as they walked. My sisters should be present by last communication. I shall have food and drink prepared as you speak with them. Godling Boy mused aloud. She reached down to lift the hem of her dress slightly, as was proper for young ladies to do, and stepped onto wrought stone ground. I did not send word ahead, as you requested. I should imagine they'll be delighted to see you again. The Godling Boy's sisters were marvellous from her memories, although she had been buried under pale blue at the time, and could not appreciate their habits. They had strange names as well. To tell on behalf of Pet Ra, Above Shield, Kase, Sander, Daylight Threads, Ore, Lear, Lord of Snarling Darknesses, More, Rig Gone. Many uncute names for such charming girls. She would have to give them more appropriate friend names. That would be lovely, young Mernil. She smiled as she proceeded along. He was confused, but kept his polite smile on his face. Miriel, Jewel Daughter, had her face erupt in light reds and ears twitch as she heard and understood the name. Mernil, Jewel Lover. She let a wide and bright smile fill her face as she subtly teased her little kin. That was an exceptionally cute name. She would remember it. She heard a grunt of irritation and heavy footfalls on the other side of the door. Gently bringing her hand back down to her waist, she smiled as she waited for the most charmingly uffish godling she had ever met before to open the doorway and greet her. Soon enough, the doorway was thrown open as the young godling turned a readied scowl on whatever was on the other side of the door. The godling girl was fully mature in form from what she knew of their people's age cycles, but her soul was bound in the exuberances of youth. It was easy to tell that she was young still. Scowling, the godling girl blinked, leaning back to observe her at the door and the guards in the hallway. Taking measure of the woman at her door, the godling girl with feathers in her hair grunted out in the same accent of her little kin. Everqueen? She was more confused than anything it seemed. Good, she hadn't made such a terrible impression on the godling girls as she feared she might have. Smiling, she performed a curtsy. We had felt the desire to socialize, if that is agreeable. Godling Girl considered the request for a long moment, clearly hesitating to let her into the room, but also not wishing to shut the doorway in her face. Eventually, social decorum won out, and the young lady opened the door wide to allow her to step in. It's messy, she grunted out, clearly ashamed of the many projects and papers scattered about her personal chambers. Stepping in and giving the room a glance over, the Everqueen gave a private smile to the young lady and replied, "We suspect our chambers would be far more so had we not the aid of our little kin." Raising a hand to act silver, she gave a theatrical whisper to Pet Ra. "We find ourselves most absent-minded and careless, sleeping as a babe and forgetting the placement of our utensils." The small frown lightened a tad, a great success on her part. Pet Ra had perhaps one of the most Vorlish souls the Evergreen had ever seen, filled with black temper and speckled in fearful spots of white. The girl was quite afraid of failure, afraid of disappointing Mernel most of all. It would be difficult to get her to open up wide enough to let the Everqueen shower her in affections. The Everqueen had a plan, however. We must admit a hidden agenda. She pretended to confess as she sat down, raising a hand to delicately cover her lower face in false shame. Pet Ra narrowed her eyes and was filled with immediate, hostile suspicion. The Everqueen continued to speak. "We are from an age long past, and much of modern workings are arcane to our sight. Dreadfully fearful of embarrassing ourselves before our little kin, we thought to ask a favor." Pet Ra, understanding the motivation deeply, slowly nodded as she took a seat opposite to her. Shuffling slightly, she confessed, "The artifice of this age, the craft of the materium. We know nothing of its working. Our focus was always on the workings of the immaterium. Would you be willing to speak to us at length on the subject? Pet. Ra blinked in slight surprise, considering the statement. Lilith in excitement, warring with volish bleakness. What subject first? First, she slowly asked, pulled in as a fish on a line. The power mail is completely foreign to our sensibilities. It reminds us of the old crock workings, the few examples of which we held in our museums, nothing like what the Eld used. We would like to learn of it. The Everqueen smiled as Pet Ra was won over in an instant, immediately glancing over to her technical manuals open on side tables and papers filled with notation. She had, of course, seen the tomes immediately upon entering and formulated her questioning around that subject. The subject that Pet Ra was already immensely interested in herself, from what she could tell. I suppose I can talk about it. Shyly, cutely, the young lady began to retrieve documents and diagrams with a small scowl on her face. Delighted, a wonderful name came to her as she watched the young lady gather the papers and began to lecture on the workings of materium craft. Pengar Tamu, Pout, Smith. Heels gently tapping on the stone floor, she walked down the rows of tome shelves until she found her next bonding target. Smiling, she reached up to rap gently against the wooden frame, bringing attention to herself. Her guards were mostly arrayed around the door and halls, one standing at attention behind her shoulder. The godling girl brought her gaze up from the heavy tome in her hands and smiled widely when she laid eyes upon the Everqueen. Performing an immediate and most proper bow, the godling girl spoke. Lady Everqueen, I wasn't expecting you to be here. Lord Asanil's wedding celebration doesn't start for another week. Smiling in turn, she gently stepped forwards and replied, It is because there is another week before that we are here. We thought to amend our indisposed state with renewed relations. You were kind to us in our deep blue, so we seek to return that kindness. The smile was warm yellow, the soul behind the smile was filled with bronze. A fearsome combination. It's not a great worry. I sympathize with your situation. It must be quite stressful to wake up in such times as these. The youngest godling spoke, raising a hand to politely rest upon her cheek. I don't hold it against you. I don't hold it against you. We are gladdened to learn that. Now we seem to recall an inquisition that we failed to properly answer before. Would you wish to return to the subjects? Oh, genuine excitement finally filled the warm eyes of the young lady. Yes, I would like that a great deal. Should we, may I retrieve my utensils and papers? But of course, we have also prepared a tome for you should you wish for it. Walking over to the nearby table, piled with books and parchments and quills and ink, she allowed her escort to pull the chair out for her before lowering herself into it. Quickly, the young godling moved to clear the items on the table into neat rows off to the side and retrieve one quill, one inkpot, and one stack of parchment. Holding out a hand, her escort reached into his lovely purse and retrieved a handwritten tome, a diary of sorts, and an educational book in other ways. Sliding it over to the young lady, who took it into her hands and brushed fingers across the leather and gold bindings, bound by a kind young eld in Charnax. Honestly, what kind of name was Nape Vengeance? Charn. Brushing the thought aside, the Everqueen explained the book. A tome detailing all we know of my greater half, our role as Everqueen, our experiences with her. All things related to Isha that we are aware of. You expressed interest in her last we met, and all she could do was weep out songs of misery. How shameful of her. We couldn't manage to fit all we knew of our pantheon and living in those days, however. Not in the time we had to record such. Smiling at the girl, struggling with her desire to read the new trove of knowledge, she continued, which is why we shall be happy to discuss such at length, should you wish. Yes. Daylight, Threads almost shouted. Quickly she brought up a hand and coughed into it, pretending that she had something in her throat before trying again. Yes, I would very much like that. Are you available at the moment? Yes, we shall be for another hour or two. What would you like us to speak on? Living Waters was a title I found in many old books, but it doesn't seem to be in common use any longer. I was about to go ask the Well Singer when he found time again, but you are here now. Nodding, the Everqueen began to explain. Isha is the goddess of many things: life, healing, growth, fertility, nature, the harvest. Her oldest and most potent form, though, is that of water. Primordial waters are the origin of life on maiden worlds, from which the most basic things sprout from and develop. Seawater, of course, is not suitable for crop and drinking. Fresh water, and specifically flowing fresh water, is what must be used for this. For water that lives is water that supports life. Flowing water does not tolerate filth and miasma, the things that bring illness and parasitism. A running river cares not who comes to drink from it, predator or prey. It cares not for your failures or successes. It does not invoke judgment upon mortals. The living waters flow, and in flowing they wash away foul things. It is flowing waters, living waters that are most holy. They wash away impurity, filth, sickness, sins. Isha of living. Waters represents this. The inverse of still waters, dead waters, stagnant waters, to which Isha is anathema to. Bright, inquisitive bronze polished itself with whites and golds as the young godling listened to her tutelage. The Everqueen was delighted at the efficacy of her fishing. The bathes on Baston were in the fashion of eld bathes, a wonderful point of comfortable familiarity. The waters were drawn from a nearby river, heated with arcane materium devices, and filled an artificial hot spring with wonderfully cleansing waters. Hot and steaming, opening pores and washing away impurities in the gentle flow of the water. It was quite delightful. Resting within the waters, she waited for her next target to approach, something she had learned from brief glances into the white road before her. Her ear twitched as the next young godling slipped into the waters on the far end of the chamber, also seeking the comfort of the artificial springs, and not knowing that the Everqueen was also within. Soon the godling rounded the corner and pushed past the steams, only to freeze as she encountered the Everqueen in the alcove next to the alcove that she normally visited. Letting her ears twitch visibly and slowly opening her eyes, she pretended to take in the newcomer for a moment before smiling gently. "Ah, are we in your favoured spot?" she asked, knowing she wasn't. "We can move, if you desireth." In the prickly manner that youth were prone to, but too proud to move away, the young godling replied, "No," before moving over to her desired spot and sinking almost completely under the waters. "We had thought to bathe for the evening meal. The warm waters do the body well," she explained, not looking at the young lady and potentially frightening her off. "Didn't know you were here." Lord of Snarling Darkness replied, a dreadfully uncute name she had been cursed with. The Everqueen would have to fix that in time. "Ah!" Acting bashfully, she raised a hand to her face. "We were hoping to make our visitation something of a surprise." The fanfare grows wearisome at times, bringing a shamed blush to our ears. Moments of comfortable silence are rarely found, it seems. Yeah. It's nice." The young lady slowly rose from the water, now letting her neck be revealed. She still wasn't looking at her, the skittish girl she was. "Do you mind if we trouble you, seeing the opportunity?" She spoke again, causing the girl to retreat slightly before the Everqueen continued. "It's easier to wash the back with aid. We shall be delighted to do the same for you." Kind eyes looked into nervous ones. The Everqueen let her ears sway in a friendly manner. Eventually the young godling spoke again. Very well. Moving over to her, the rest of their time in the hot baths was spent in relative silence. Relative, comfortable, relaxing silence. She would be able to approach the girl in other places now, not just here, where she was most at ease. An excellent first step in reeling her in. Oh, how about Briggle? That might be a cute friend name. Stepping through the halls, flanked by her escorts, she felt an ear twitch as the presence watching her white path finally began to move. Keeping her path straight and predictable to the young observer, they eventually met at an intersection about 15 paces from now, a future that had yet to happen. "What is your aim?" Sharp and judging eyes glared into her. The last sister of the godling boy. The Everqueen smiled, both in present and in the moment that was about to happen. "I'm feeling quite motherly. I wish to heap affection onto the cute little godlings I see," she replied in the moment to come. The white vision faded. She stepped into the intersection. The last godling was already there, staring at her with blank eyes. A moment passed. Casa Santa nodded in acceptance. Honesty won her over in a moment. The Everqueen was an excellent angler. He took solace in the truth that if his daughter had been utterly twisted by the taint of chaos, he would still be able to feel her soul. It would shine like a pitch-black star in a sea of rot and foulness, easily visible against this backdrop of wretched green. She was not visible. She was therefore not here. The star on his brow burned gold as his will was maintained on producing a great flame, enveloping the ships of his fleet. Waves of defilement crashed against the Geller fields, which flickered even at full power against the onslaught. Wherever they failed, his will carried the slack and annihilated all that attempted to approach. The men and women in the helm were shuddering in soul-deep disgust, staring down at a world that glowed with resplendent toxins. Most did not know the reasons, though the quick glances at the status of the Geller fields and the warp lenses told them more than what they needed to know. The world of Barbarous was utterly consumed by the foulness of chaos, by the daemon predators that lurk therein, by the twisting of false gods and loathsome parasites. He had never seen a calamity on this scale, nor of this magnitude. Warp storms are typically quite content to remain in the warp, only influencing the materium in subtle manners. The world of Barbarous had no barrier between immaterium and materium any longer, and a predominant song had taken root in its soil. He knew it was a theoretical possibility, but the sight was shocking all the same, even if the solution was as simple as it had always been. Run a sword through its heart. He needed to destroy it before it was allowed to spread further. The moment he stood from this chair, his ships would be on a timer. How long could they last before the Geller fields failed entirely? 2 days, perhaps. So he would assume a single day instead, and purge the world of chaos by the 24th hour. He summoned up a fraction of will and linked his mind to the internal communication systems. In broad and deep baritone, he rumbled out over the length and breadth of the helm chamber and the hundreds of officers and crew therein, and the hundreds of thousands of auxiliary officers listening through intercoms. Look upon the face of the warp. Look upon the enemy of mankind. In all its grand malignance, know that lesser creatures name these things divinity. He paused for a moment, then continued. Know that they are merely monsters. Know that mankind shall deal with these monsters in the same manner we have dealt with any other enemy. Steel in hand, fire in heart. He paused for a brief moment, considering what weapons to call upon. Not virus, bombs. The world felt too closely aligned with such a thing for him to feel confident in its success. He preferred to leave the planet intact and usable in the future, so not cyclonic torpedoes. I am the Emperor of mankind. I sentence the planet Barbarous to exterminatus extremis, a mercy compared to its current state. Ready the atomic bombardment. Atomic weaponry was rather primitive for this day and age, but just as effective as it had always been. A salvo of several thousand standard-size missiles would likely prove effective while also getting rid of the blasted things taking up space in his ships. Several hours later, he stared rather nonplussed at the planet Barbarous, the surface of which should be reduced to atomic ash from the many thousands of atomics of hundreds of megatons of destructive force each, spread across the surface in a nice grid pattern. Instead, it was still there, the rippling surface of rot, being struck by the materium bombs and shuddering in the way thick sheets of blubber might, dissipating the force of impact into the surrounding warp with little lasting damage to the planet itself. He was not sure how much he accomplished with that, but at least he got rid of the relics in his storage. He rumbled out another declaration, ignoring the horrified reactions of those in the helm as the bombardment did not significantly damage the planet. It seems conventional tactics will not work. Ready all forces for deployment. I shall lead the battle, personally. My lord, came the shout of many. He was impressed they had the spine to actually speak up. Taking over for the rest, his second-in-command spoke out. Lord Emperor, the planet Just resisted a salvo of weapons that could incinerate Terra itself. Is it not prudent to make tactical withdrawal? He raised his hand slightly, palm facing upwards. For the current moment, yes, it would be prudent to leave the area and come back another time with superior weaponry. For the latter moment, consider, if you would, the following. Pointing at the warp lenses, he spoke a line that chilled all who listened. We have been in the system for several hours. The radius of its influence has expanded 1/10 of 1%. It is currently strong enough to force our Geller fields to flicker on occasion. Letting his hand rest once more, he finished. "Well, no. We are going to purge this planet immediately and rid ourselves of a much greater threat at a later date. Ready all forces for deployment and withdraw the fleet to the maximum range of the Imperial Teleportation Array. We shall proceed with the battle as follows. Or, Barbarous was a planet transformed by foul songs. Its oceans rolled with sewage and pus. Its mountains wobbled and flexed as rotten cartilage. Its flora bloomed and died in moments, a cycle of rot and renewal that left a thick floor of death upon all surfaces. Skies rolled with newborn miasma, the stench of rot and clouds of bile-like dew wafting in belching breezes. A distant, haunting laughter echoing in the deep horizons. And crawling up from the deep places, countless hordes of crawling things came up to replace those annihilated by nuclear fire. In the thousands, in the millions, more and more than what the mortal eye could hope to discern emerging from canyons that bled red water and flexed like torn muscle. Continents heaving like the abdomen of a wounded beast, and a great cavernous maw that gnashed at the bottom of its seas of decay, tongue-lapping and tasting the filth that foamed out and around its torn mountain gums and towering tooth-peaks. In a crash of heavenly thunder, a massive man appeared in the skies above the most clear continent, clad in golden power mail of such immensity that it outweighed lighter tanks. Massive relic bolt cannons mounted on his lower forearms and blessed missile launchers carried on his back. One hand carried a sword, the other carried lightning. He was clad in gold, red and black. He bore 1,000 songs. In his heavy power mail, he stood 11 cubits in height. 1,000,000 lesser voices cried out as they raced for the man, carrying songs of ruin and despair with them, eager to share their blessings and curses with the man, eager to incorporate his gold into their songs, eager to snuff out his light, terrified of his royalty. He paid them no heed and shut out their voices with a thought. The man wore a helm bearing the form of a horned skull, and a sun in miniature burned on his brow and about his head and behind his head like a crown and halo of resplendent gold. 2 circles that intersect as cogs may, and 1 point of focus. His armor was adorned in eagles and thunder, and the aquila was borne on his chest as a gilded standard. The man stood steady upon vapor and light, looked down upon the unclean world, and proclaimed judgment upon it. "I bring you fire." The hand holding lightning extended forth. The psychic amplifiers of the immense power mail burned to life, channeling his will and empowering it with arcane systems. In a place as this, the immaterium and materium were one in the same, and all could behold the truth of powers. Upon the world of Barbarous, a pillar of fire burned to life, spinning as a mighty arrow, and crashing down on the inland sea below. A great flame washed out, and all the little songs were burnt up, and the blood sea parted and boiled up, and the cartilage land was made into thick ash and solid soot. The pillar spread out as a wall of flame and struggled against the sea of rot about it. And in the wake of the pillar, following in a second burst of archaeotech lightning, an angel appeared over the hard ash and packed soot. The angel stood twice the height of a man, with wings of marble and a sword of salt, and blue flame travelled in his wake. In fury, the angel roared out, and a halo of fire appeared about its head, and songs of rot were drawn into the halo and burned as kindling. The rot weakened, the fire began to spread steadily across the surface, land beneath rendered unto ash. Greater songs of rot finally completed their ponderous pace across the land, and attempted to snuff out the flames. The angel crashed into the first great unclean one as a bolt of lightning, roaring with thunder and fire. "Oh, what rude visitors!" the chiefest rot rebirth song declared, voice echoing from its mountain throne many kilometers away. It rose up on gangrenous legs and began to stumble its way down the blubbery mountainside, bringing all that terrible racket and mess into our home. "Come now, surely you know that it's most impolite?" The man turned his gaze to the chiefest song and replied in a voice that carried over the void. "Beachhead established. Send forth my talons." In 1,000 cracks of relic lightning, men and women, demigods all, appeared in the center of the ashlands. Clad in heavy golden mail, carrying arms that crackled with lighting and guns that spat fire, they moved as pairs to fan out in a circle. The women had souls of void, which drank the songs about them and established materium where they walked. The men had bodies of bronze, and they shattered demons as they approached the expanding circle of fire. Gunlaves sung with murder strokes or belched beams of disintegrating light. Along the terrible horizon, great shifting masses began to writhe, and eyes bloomed to life to stare at the intruding gold. Delighted howls began to echo over the winds, and swarms of infesting vermin began to descend upon the light and fire and warriors. In response, the angel roared back, and plates of marble flesh began to unfold, revealing intersecting lines and swirling smokeless fire. In 4,000 more cracks of lightning, another wave of men and women appeared in the center of the ashfields. Thralls and bondsmen of the demigods, second-line soldiers dedicated to carrying ammo and spare arms for their lords. They quickly proceeded upwards, trusting their lords to shoot down all that approached, and handed off loaded secondary weapons with mastered ease. In each group of warrior thralls, one man reloaded the mighty gunglaves, while 2 more supported their lord with covering fire. Secondary arms and primary arms were exchanged again, and the demigods cut ruin into the next wave of laughing daemons. The cycle proceeded as such, following in the wake of the circle of flame and preventing anything from snuffing it out with bile or pus. In the air above, smashing between giant winged beasts, things near to but not quite bats and vultures that cried out spells of despair, as an azure comet, an angel roared out in hateful commandments. Each command synchronized with another blow which ruptured a daemon on its blade of salt and shattered the air with its wing beats. Os, theos, be, smote, be smote, e, smote, be, smote. The man clad in gold and names spoke out once more, voice like fire and smashing into tides of rot before they could wash over his forces. Front line established. Send forth my Astartes. In 10,000 cracks of lightning, mighty warriors clad in finest mail and wielding great weapons appeared in the center of the ashlands. They bore 20 banners, 500 warriors to each. The first of 100 planned waves of these superhuman warriors. The warriors proceeded forwards in mighty packs, following in the wake of the fire and demigods, and moving to support the front line with guns that shot beams of deflagrating heat and furious will in the face of world-consuming decay. They were lesser to the demigods in gold, but far, far greater in number, and in number they marched out to cast forth fire and cleanse the world they now tread upon. The center of the ashlands was now a constant storm of crackling technological lightning, each thundercrack bringing forth another 10,000 superhuman soldiers in heavy plate. Above their heads their emperor stood, aloft on beams of light, and hands held wide as he forced the firewall to burn over the lands. About him darted the angel, who shattered all that approached to attack him and devoured their song souls to feed his crystal flames, roaring in hateful commandments. The daemons grew greater and greater in scale as the battle proceeded, giants of vaguely animal form and bone, laughing merrily as their rotting limbs hauled them to the front lines of the firewalls, spitting bile and poison like gunfire and spreading limb-rotting sickness at any exposed joint or man struck too squarely. The ground rumbled and heaved. A massive worm burst forth from the ground underneath the hunting pack of Astartes, closer in scale to whales than any mundane creature, dragging itself forwards on thousands of rusted iron legs and hungrily devouring warriors in its gaping, torn maw. Some 200 died the moment it emerged. It swung its head about for a brief moment. A moment more was all the time it had to exist. An azure bolt crashed into the titanic creature, the angel ripping into the landworm with twin swords of salt and screaming flame. Its song died the moment its head was cleaved in quarters and ignited in dying blue. The angel's halo devoured it at that moment. The flame wall paused in its advance for a moment, the emperor flexing a fraction of his will to defend himself from the 100-fold rot rakes unable to spread his imperial truth in that time. Another 100 superhumans died along the front lines in the time it took for the Angel to return to his sentry post and allow the Emperor to dedicate his full efforts to the flame once more. Most carried banners, a handful were clad in gold. Another final flash of archaeotech lightning, and the last of the 1 million Astartes finally stomped their plated feet onto the planet. Counting each and every wave, the Emperor called out again. Front line reinforced. Send forth my war striders. Flashes of lightning, more massive than anything previous, erupted in the center of the ashlands. Hunchbacked giants of plasteel and adamantium crashed their feet onto the surface of the planet. Small at first, a mere 15 cubits, and carrying heavy autoguns, the giants strode forth and began to unleash targeted fire at the skies, advanced systems giving them immense accuracy as they began to clear the air of rot drakes and free up the Angel for other duties. Giant bloated forms finally finished their lumbering stride towards the front lines, sweeping immense blades of rusted godsteel down at the soldiers of man. Jolly laughter echoed out as these blades made a mockery of lesser armor, twisting it into rust and dust, and the men who bore it into corpses and heaps. Demigods of gold leapt and spun, twisting around the majority of these swipes and carving great channels and flensing wounds into the rotten forms. Their thralls shot fire into these wounds. The Astartes pumped annihilating heat into these great daemons and their lessers, coordination allowing them greater killing power than their lesser weapons would suggest. The second wave of war striders appeared in lightning, following after their smaller brethren. 20 to 30 cubits in height now, and carrying heavy arms of thunderous applause and missiles upon their backs. Their bolts cast out, and immense giants were forced to stagger back at the weight of these blows, opening them up to greater wounds by the demigods and Astartes. The war striders cried out in knightly boasting, and their song joined the chorus of wrath that filled with ashlands, spreading them further still. In the distance, the rumbling earth revealed itself. It was not earth. It was a great shelled beast, and stared out with milky eyes and writhing claws. Each great shake was a colossal step forwards that brought the mountain-sized thing closer and closer. Its song joined the chorus, and a great tsunami of exhaustion washed over the battlefield. But the waters did not overcome the fire, and the flame continued its march against the sea. Another flash of lighting, greater still than anything previous, burst forth. Ever larger war striders appeared in the ashlands, clad in blue-white heraldry and songs of praise to the machines in their hearts. 30 cubits, then 55 cubits, then 75 cubits. Each great form carried greater and greater weaponry still, a legion of titans. The world shook and wobbled. The lord of this place, Rutigus the Rainmaker, a most favoured son of Nurgle, finished his march down from the mountains. He carried decay and rebirth in his hands and spread his arms in praise and love. Great laser fire from the war striders raced forwards, and waves of rot rose to shield him from their blows. Clouds of steaming bile heralded his arrival as ever more wretched water rose up to defend their loving master. Chiding, he called out with a ruined mouth that spilled maggots upon the earth. "Come now, can't you see, this is all very little of you? The blessings are freely given. You don't need to ask or stamp your feet." Raising his ever-dying staff high, the great bloated form began to weave a song of ruination. "Allow me to help you." The Lord was interrupted as a screaming angel crashed into him with nuclear blue flames. The angel forced Rutigus back for 1,000 cubits, inarticulate roars of endlessly burning fury calling out from his barely recognizable form of shifting marble innards and burning cerulean flesh. The sea itself rose up, mass pooling together in 1,000 tons of decaying poison, a shifting face almost seeming to appear. It rolled forwards in a roar of waterfalls and sizzle of acid, and all it touched died in pain. Barely, the first of its waves began to crest over the front lines of the ever-spreading flame. A crack of archaeotech lighting. An avatar of the machine god stepped forth, 270 cubits in height. A fortress cathedral built upon its hunched back, bristling with weaponry. Its right arm glowed hot, a beam of white, a horizontal tower, a wall of hot death. The rot sea was parted, and boiled away, unable to reach the front line before being unmade by holy fire. The Emperor spoke, blazing like a sun in the sky of a world that welcomed no light. Imperator Titan deployed. Go forth and purge. Send forth my auxilia. In the wake of an Imperator warstrider, a walking fortress of annihilation, without peer, mere men followed with autoguns, munition plate, and faith in their Emperor. Barbarous shuddered, and for the first time it was not a merry one. It did not take long for his kind to appear on this world again, laughing and swaying in the drunkenness of despair, of fuchsia indulgence to numb the horrors they had wrought. They appeared in the skies, sailing through the air upon vessels meant for recreation and painted in the symbols of theatre thieves, making sport of lesser races. Worthless urbanites, they should be making sport of each other and rid the wheel of their presence. They had not noticed him, their souls too drunk with fuchsia. He was barely hidden upon the ridge overlooking the sanctuary city of Slayakin, one of 7 on this vol-racked world. Like everything else he had seen of the Slayakin, they were highly imperfect, placed near to, but not exactly upon the most stable sections of world plate, with primitive songs to guide them and primitive tools to build with. Their crops grew rich from the fertile ashlands, and their craftsmen were knowledgeable in the shaping of metals. They were fearful of his urbanite kine, ignorant of the strength of their numbers against such cowardly folk. Not one warrior was among this bunch. A mere 300 children of wealth and nobility, who had never held an arm against a peer opponent in their entire lives. He was quite another story. The son of a dragon lord and a ranger. War was his master, death his mistress. And when there was no campaigning to do, he was a farmer. It was a satisfying life. The Slayakin hid fearfully in the bounds of their sanctuary city. The urbanites approached with revelry. He raised his shuriken cannon from its place by his side and began to fire down from the spire rooftop that he had set himself upon. The shuriken cannon sheared off a fraction of its ammo block, and the gravitic accelerators flung the blade fragment down the barrel and towards the band of merry swords and swaying handguns. The next fraction of a second sent another fragment of ammo block down. Then the next, then the next, then the next. 100 fragments fired within a single exhale of air. 100 fragments fell upon the urbanites, clad in mere mesh and costume. A dozen died in the first burst fire of bladed rain descending upon them. He felt a black pleasure at seeing the fuchsia spell upon them break in an instant. They shouted and stumbled back, staring at their slaughter fellows in fear and confusion. He adjusted his aim and fired another burst of bladed rain from his shuriken cannon. Another 10 were sheared into heaps of irregularly butchered meat. His kine began to search for him, set upon the rooftops as he was, slightly hidden by the architecture of this place. A group began to run, heading for the safety of the buildings within the sanctuary city of Slayakin. He did not allow this. Another bladed rain fell upon them, and those closest to the city died in moments. He watched impassively as their souls were devoured by swirling fuchsia. The fuchsia turned an eye to him, features coy and song, shuddering in sick pleasure. He glared at it through the protection of the amulets and spirit stone allocated to him for this quest. It would not be able to sup on his soul, no matter what occurred this day. The fuchsia sighed temptingly and busied itself with drinking the souls of its forebears. They had begun to fire upon the rooftops now, still ignorant to his true position, still wielding sidearms of meagre strength. He let another burst of bladed rain fall, and another 10 were devoured. Their morale was faltering now. He could break them. He warred with his desire to see them dead for a moment, before letting the gold tighten around his brow. He stood from his rooftop, he stepped forwards, and leapt. Mere metal warped under the force of his jump, and he soared through the air for a moment. His legs absorbed the impact of landing on ashlands, cracking stone under the weight of his arms and armor. Slowly he rose to full height before the scattered and white-painted urbanites. Heavy wraithbone mail covered the form of an exodite siege ranger, hefting a mighty shuriken cannon in 2 thickly muscled arms, covered in protective amulets and bands of warding song. He raised his weapon, itself taller than any of the princelings before him. A bladed storm issued forth. He kept up his fire as they ran, eager to deal death upon those who had earned it many times over. He only stopped when his weapon finally expended its ammo block. Unfortunately, about a dozen finally escaped, lifting off in a recreational cruiser and through a gate to the webway. He grunted with displeasure before marching back towards the sanctuary city. Ignoring the fearful looks of the Slayerkin, he rose in great bounds and clings to handholds along the original tower, returning to his lookout position on one of their primitive rooftops and engaging in the expected maintenance required for his weapons, mostly just reloading his shuriken cannon and returning to his relaxed repose underneath one of the overhanging roofs above. He was to be here for some time, most likely. He had known that as he had volunteered for this duty, he heard the scrambling climb long before it reached him. Hands and feet from a creature significantly more clumsy than any eld, slowly climbing up the side of the tower structure. This was quite the feat, as he was quite certain that there was no scaffolding to aid in the ascent, meaning that whoever was approaching had scaled a few hundred feet without support. He let his hand rest near his sidearm, waiting in a seemingly relaxed state for whoever was approaching to finally overcome the last outcropping of ancient construction. He did not extend his senses out to observe them in advance. He could see the fuchsia waiting for his overextension. What an annoying predator! He would shoot it from the seas if he could. But one must be mindful of their limits. He'd content himself with cutting off its fingers whenever he could. A hand grabbed the edge of his resting platform, the same darkened grey that all people of this world bore, bombarded by higher levels of sunlight as they were, standard of scale, but dainty and slight in the ways that woman hands were. It was the soul attached to the hand that told him the identity of the one coming to inspect him. More specifically, the spiritual superweapon that was set between her soul and shell. A starheart, even a primitive one, was quite a rare sight in these grim times. He had been astonished the first time he had seen it upon his arrival to this world. The godling pulled herself up, clad in drakehide and scales, liliath white mane flowing like licks of flame at their ends, eyes a deep vol, black bejewelled with an iris of shifting, warm, volcanic tones. She was not quite as tall as an eld maiden, but from his knowledge of the slayer of evil, she would come to grow much larger in a few short cycles. She was the reason why he was here, after all. He let his mask tilt slightly, turning to the godling and being careful to not look too deep into her soul. It was most impolite to do that to primitives. She caught the gaze, not hefting the hammer at her waist just yet, but wary and evaluating. Healthy, at least. With the lean muscle of youthful animals and broad shoulders and hips, she was being fed well enough, he supposed. He did not know how much that was with Slayerkin. She stared for a moment longer, glancing over to the battlefield now cleaned of corpses and pilfered of sidearms, and then back to his own arms. She spoke something in a language he didn't understand, the crude tongue of materium and flesh. He, remembering the book of translation he had been provided for this quest, tilted his head in a manner that signified that he didn't understand her words. Slowly he pushed himself up, reaching for his travel bag and pulling out the booklet that contained a lexicon. Flipping through the pages for a few moments, he attempted to speak. "I do not speak your language." The words flowed in a manner standard to Eld, interrupted by the hard stops inherent to the tongue. Such harsh pauses would indicate quite a large degree of resentment in Elden tongues. She paused, considering that before slightly relaxing her stance. Staring at him for another long moment, she slowly enunciated a sentence. Memorizing the sounds and flipping through the book once more, he pieced it together after a few moments. "Why are you here?" Nodding to her to show that he translated the words, he flipped through the book again. Using his hands to indicate subject matter more clearly, he responded, "Your brother sent me. Protect you." She considered that for another moment, frowning as she lightly scratched her face in thought. Eventually she responded, and he took the time to translate the words. "Teach you language." He frowned behind his helmet, knowing that was mostly pointless. She would be retrieved soon enough, and he had no need to interact with any of the locals in the meantime. In truth, he shouldn't be interacting with her at all. He glanced at her determined expression and sighed to himself, knowing that he probably wasn't going to be able to avoid this in a reasonable manner. "Okay," he grunted out. A bright look growing on her face, she fell into a seated position and put a hand on her chest. "Vesta," she declared with a grin. He slowly reached up in turn, putting his hand on his chest. Siuna's, Roim Rai. He did not bother to translate it for her benefit. Silence before the lion was a mouthful. After several hours of speaking with the godling, keeping an eye on the world around, and doing his best to be uninteresting so that the youngling would leave in boredom, she left his watchtower. She returned the next day with loaves of hard bread. The most terrifying experience he had ever lived through was the birth of She Who Thirsts, their communications with the homeworlds going dark in an instant. A storm that opened where their homeworlds in the distant sky used to be. A wave of hungering influence washing over the whole of the galaxy. The immaterial sky now tainted a light pinkish hue, and other colors burning more deeply in response to the new force. The constant gnawing on his soul, felt whenever he left the protective safeguarding of their world spirit, the waves of despair that engulfed entire sweeping sections of the wheel. Their pantheon devoured, or shattered, or gone. Only the laughter of a thirsting god in its wake. Many had only felt the volish certainty of what had happened. The birth of a new god of the eldar, a creature of the pleasure cults, something they had all foreseen well in advance. Now was time to weather the storm for however many eons it would take. Cunas had not been satisfied with that. He had begun to train as a ranger immediately, ready to join the first Elden ship off his world and towards a more active warring against the tides of hunger. A ship had come to their world. A message of hope, a lifeline. Isha was not dead. Kaini was not dead. Segorek was not dead. A demigod of a fledgling race, with Kain's arm, Segorak's commandment, and Isha's colors, had arrived to declare crusade, for the salvation of their people, with oaths sworn before the graven corpses of their gods. A massive, sprawling list of plans and details that laid out a dozen scenarios in which they could feasibly recover from this calamity. Siunas had marched to his dragon lord and demanded that they rise to the call, even if the impudence had him banished for the act. He had been expecting that one can only take so many liberties with their leaders, and the dragon lord allowed him to stay as a passenger to the Eldmoot regardless. The second most terrifying experience had been something else. An event that he later learned was the lighting of the Astronomicon, the lighting of a psychic beacon of such tremendous power that it washed out the previous hues of fuchsia and drowned a large part of the galaxy in golden sunlight. For a time, he feared that yet another new god had been born. Later, he had learned that the sun was a beacon fueled by the Emperor of mankind, father of the Slayer of evil. The Immateria did not have a sun before. Now it did. That had been the former second most terrifying experience he had ever lived through as a young warrior. He was currently replacing it with what was currently happening. It was one thing to see a spire of gold burn its way through the wheel, a new psychic spoke impaled into the firmament from a great distance away. It was quite another to feel a system-wide tide of that same golden sunfire wash over the planet, scattering all former colors before it, carrying the song of war drums and lyres with its thundering stampede. Once there were a myriad of shades and hundering hues. Now there was only Asuryani gold, everywhere he looked. He was safe in his materium flesh. He was uncertain of how he would fare as a disembodied spirit. "What is it?" Vesta spoke through a mouthful of hard bread, now a good deal taller than she was a year ago. Swallowing, she withdrew the firm loaf from where it had been, soaking in her beverage, and bit into the softened meal again. He was standing now, looking out to the distant sky, beyond the thick atmosphere and far into the distance. His features were flat as he watched a gilded sword cut through the barrier between materium and immaterium and the massive fleet that followed in its wake. It was hard not to with how brightly it shone. The gold that washed out all other colors in the system had merely been its shadow. It was crowned in sunfire. It was cloaked in ghosts. Its song was old and strong and wrathful. It was staring at the godling by his side. It was staring at him. He resisted the urge to shudder in fear. "Your father has arrived," he declared, tightening his crown of certainty. "Best prepare yourself to greet him." "Oh," Vesta replied, again through the mouthful hard bread. "You mean the Emperor, right?" "Not Dar. He said he was going to be busy with jobs for the rest of the evening." "Lots of nails this month?" He resisted the urge to sigh. "Yes, the Emperor of mankind." "Oh, I'll go talk to the Archon. It'll be nice if Hysod could have a nice celebration." She disregarded the normal standards of eating hard bread and instead crunched through the rest of the stone-light loaf in a single moment, then quickly finishing off her drink and standing up. "The other cities might want to join. We'll see if they can send some people in time." Pausing near the ladder she had constructed some time ago, the godling stared at him. He had not moved from his spot. She narrowed her eyes at him. "You're coming too." She wanted him to attend. "Absolutely not," he responded with equal stubbornness. He did not want to attend. Several minutes of fierce debating later, they compromised, and he would be attending. There was much fanfare that followed in the hours to come, the time it took for a ship on the end of the system to travel with its secondary thrusters to reach the interior, where the world he was on orbited. This was decent for primitive ships, not quite the void-tipping pace that Eldar ships could reach with their gravity sails, but not that extreme of a difference either. Certainly better than newborn star races who fumbled about at speeds that took years to reach their own outer systems. It was the intense gravity that had the strongest effect, the sheer size of the flagship exerting a force on the world and its nearby moon that he could feel deep within his bones and frame. A ship large enough to pull moons from orbit should it get too close, and without the proper gravitic measures. Slayerkin experienced a sense of lightness, aches from gravity pulling on their bones, just so slightly lessened, with the arrival of the massive golden ship above their world, hovering like a sword overhead, as if the entire world was straining ever so slightly less than before with its presence. He was learned enough in voidcraft to know what that meant. Most were unlikely to even know it was happening. That was merely the largest ship in a fleet of thousands. The scale was absurd. Apparently witnessing the celebration being wrought in his honor, the Emperor of Mankind arrived directly, a crash of materium lightning outside of the city-state, followed by 100 others as he appeared before the charcoal-skinned natives of Nocturne. Tunas wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it wasn't the unfathomable arrogance he saw before him. A world lord wears a crown of gold. A system lord might wear a crown and necklace of gold. A direction lord might wear a full array of gilded regalia, for gold was the color of Ashurian, king of the gods and master of all things. The Emperor of Mankind had skin of bronze, hair of black, and a crown of gold. His armor, from gorget to sabaton, was brilliant gold, overwhelmingly gold, covered in birds of prey and deathly faces, in filigree and crawling gold and silver vines, in silver-black crosses and red tassels and yellow stars. It was adorned in silver masks and cream parchment seals, cloaked in blood-red silk with the pelt of some immense white, feline beast serving as his mantle. Only the Wheel Lord would dare wear such gold, to declare himself master of the galaxy and all within it. No Wheel Lord had been crowned in an eon or more, none having the ability to truly unite the disparate Eldar under their throne. The Emperor of Mankind wasn't even an Eldar. In the distance the Emperor approached and exchanged words with those watching the gates. He was allowed in, being forced to duck through the two small entrants in order to march through the gates. Behind him followed a procession of what he assumed was his personal guard, who were wearing almost as much gold as the Emperor himself was, ignoring the differences in raw volume due to height. He met his daughter in the center, Vesta standing at about half his height, with both hammers on her waist and her finest salamander cloak about her shoulders as she stood next to the Archon, a mere mortal man who looked as if he wished to be anywhere else in the presence of such immense souls. Siunas sympathized with the Slayerkin. The father of the Slayer of Evil spoke in a voice that matched his song, the beat of heavy war drums, the tune of gentle lyres, the trample of hooves and the wing-beat of eagles. He could not understand the language. He did not need to. The tone and enunciation made it clear as a warm greeting. Vesta spoke, for the Archon was in no condition to reply with the weight of gold passively resting upon the city. "You are my father, I suppose." The Emperor of Mankind. The giant in gold, Siunas just noticed that the man was as tall as a Wraithlord, replied, this time in the familiar tongue of Nocturne. It still rippled with his presence, impossible to restrain any further with its magnitude. "And you are my daughter. Have they given you a name?" Plus, Vesta smiled broadly. "Good Smith and Bell took me in when I landed. He has named me Vesta. The giant nodded with a smile barely visible through the burning sun on his brow. Vesta, then. I'd come to retrieve you. Have you any business upon this world before our departure? Blas Vesta nodded. No great event is complete without a grand celebration. A week of festivities and games for all 7 sanctuary cities, then I'll depart without regrets. The giant considered that for a long moment, before nodding. I shall have my custodians arrange gifts. A detachment to integrate and uplift this world was already planned. My scouts tell me this world has been beset by Xenos. Is this true? Vesta grinned and pointed at him. Siunas wished to flee immediately. Used to be until Kiunas showed up. The Emperor of Mankind turned his gaze to the Eldar, trying his best to hide behind the table of breads and salted meats. There was a moment of quiet. I should like to speak with Siunas, then. Shall you introduce us, Vesta? I intended to. The words from the godling's mouth sounded like an execution sentence. He had been betrayed, then. Vol black in his soul, Chiunas Roimri marched forwards to meet his death with dignity. Truly, he should have put forth more effort into avoiding her. The celebrations upon Nocturne did his daughters good, and, while more subdued upon the ships, he gave approval for a small victory festival to take place amongst his fleet. Small in actionable scope, not in overall participants. Many medals and minor trophies were already handed out some months ago upon his orders, for exceptional duty in the field of Barbarous. But this little event was an additional honor given unto them for performances thus far. His warriors cared little for the specific reasons. For the most part, all they cared for was the extra ration of wine, extra hours allocated to relaxation, and the opening of the special occasions pantries. The bit of merriment was good for them. His daughters were caught up in the celebratory spirit that Vesta brought with her, ever bright against the grim realities of living upon such a world. Or perhaps it was her raising upon Nocturne that allowed her to maintain such a bright outlook. He did not know. Nocturne was a place of tremendous power, the spirits of the world glutted with volcanic energies and shifting in tectonic slumber. He was emboldened to see humanity surviving even on such a world. He ordered the construction of city-scale void shields and the reconstruction of their settlements in full. They certainly deserved such a reward for struggling valiantly for so long. They had sheltered Vesta as best they could, and it was far better than he feared was possible. The machine wars saw many weapons of grand and terrible design, constructed, barely tested, and deployed en masse. Wonder weapons, they were sometimes called, New Age artifacts, super prototypes. Their names varied from front to front, their effect was similar on each. Massive devastation for both sides, as these grand engines of destruction often went awry and left broken worlds in their wake. He knew this, for he had ordered their deployment many times. He was reluctant to do so, as his body gave way to more and more weakness of flesh and blood from the constant warring, as his mind grew more and more weary with months without proper rest, as his sword arm was not long enough to cover the entire front line against the men of iron. He would lose more and more ground. Lose more and more men. More and more and more. Once the situation had become drastic enough, the deployment of a wonder weapon would finally be approved, often years before he would consider them ready. The end result was almost always the same. Pyrrhic victory, if not just outright mutual destruction. The result was always the ash of a world, of a system, of a sector. He would need such weapons for the Imperium, for mankind, for those scenarios where no amount of strength of arms or massed men were enough. He knew that it was within his capabilities to construct examples of such. He knew this, the roar of a year monster, imprisoned in its artifice armor, screams that unmade swathes of reality before him, the death knell of a world, and faces that he could no longer remember. Vesta was built for this purpose, mind churning with the knowledge required to assemble these weapons of utter annihilation. The Imperium would need them in those most desperate times. But only in those most desperate times, only then. To this end, he made her strong, as greatly the thewed as the human frame would allow, backed by the energies of a handcrafted infinity engine implanted into her soul. a reactor of psychic energies channeled through her soul shape and into her body to provide a constant increase in physical parameters, and an unlimited capacity for regenerative reconstruction of body. Vesta would have the longest and strongest sword arm. Vesta would recover the quickest and surest. Vesta would bear nearly unlimited stamina and tolerance for suffering. Vesta would have his endless, burning love of humanity and the greatest reluctance to deploy New Age artifacts. She would have the least need for such, all to ensure the most devastating weapons of humanity were under the strictest locks and keys, but still usable. The greatest warden for the greatest of weapons. He supposed they should be called something specific and grandiose in this era. He did not care to linger upon the thought. Vesta had done well for herself in his absence. The Xeno standing next to the Golden Throne was partly responsible for that, it seems. Eldar, he knew of their species. This was the second member of an Exodite Eldar he had met thus far. The other had been a simple messenger, not enough information to confirm or deny much. This one was one of their warriors, bound in muscle more thickly than he considered possible for their kind. Most of his past experiences with the Eldar were hearing their perverse screams as they cut bloody swathes into his men and drug many away, never to be seen again. Thin and black-clad creatures that were stronger than any normal man, far faster, far more agile, and more practiced in and powerful in psyche than most any save himself. Just one was often enough to cut down entire squadrons. They travelled in packs, upon impossibly agile ships, through gateways into a parallel realm, and seeking nothing save captives and the thrill of torment. One of the great terrors upon the Federation of old. Thoughts of allying with such creatures was unthinkable to him. Fortunately, it was to his supposed son as well, for the Exodites appeared radically different from their urbanites' kin. Not that he let this Sioinas leave his awareness since coming aboard his ship. He was extending a hand of tentative trust, not foolish enough to expose his back. He had been questioning the Eldar on a great quantity of subjects, mostly pertaining to knowledge of his own people and knowledge of his supposed son's activities thus far, all of which was recorded by an autoquill inscribed in ink and parchments. It was typically safer to store potentially critical information on entirely permanent and physical mediums to avoid problematic tampering. Ink and parchment was perhaps the most economical of those mediums and thus commonly used. The moot took the better part of 2 sun cycles to conclude, with the suggestions of Rundasil considered and heavily debated upon by the eldest war leaders in attendance. The concluded course of action was 2 allied but functionally independent groups. The Exodite worlds and Rundasil would consolidate and conquer under his direction and provide aid to the Exodus, Lord Malekith, and Exodus fleet. They would travel to the Monitor Wraith, the great vortex somewhere north of your homeworld, I believe, and establish a stronghold kingdom against it. Rundasil was the name they had given to his supposed son. He had briefly touched up upon his eldon before leaving Terra. It was a roughly equivalent translation as far as his knowledge extended. Such a thing would be required for the incursion into the Bile Bastard's domain to come, and The Emperor shifted slightly, realizing what he heard. The Eldar ceased in his speaking immediately, waiting for him to complete his thought and wave him to continue speaking. The warp storm to the north, the most significant one at least, was the relatively newly born Cygnus X-1, the most significant and terrible persistent warp storm yet discovered. They had to skip around the majority of it, Geller fields at full strength for weeks, as they skirted along its edges. He said relatively newly born because it was roughly half a century old. He had felt the tidal wave of chaotic energies wash out from it. It was half the reason he built the Astronomicon, to wash away its influence from the Sol system, the other half being the numerous benefits to transportation from the increased clarity in the warp. An incursion into the Bile Bastard's domain through Cygnus X-1, that was an invasion of a daemon's realm. A significant one at that, a place controlled by a warp predator of significant power and song, enough to carve out a mostly persistent realm for itself in the warp. The one who named Bile Bastard. I am unfamiliar with that particular title. He spoke out, making sure to be careful with his declarations in the presence of so many mortal humans. A warp predator that has plagued your people, then? The eldar stared at him for some moments. He raised a slow, imperious brow. The helm was mostly silent. After some time, the eldar spoke out in an unsure question. "Ah?" The eldar paused again, before finally getting a complete sentence out. "No, I suppose you wouldn't have knowledge of Sha'iel as my people do. Your race is terribly young yet." There was a complicated emotion in his voice as he spoke. Sha'iel was their name for the warp. He rumbled out a reply. "The history of mankind stretches back more than 50,000 years. How storied are your people to name my people young? That was about correct, was it not? It was the 30th millennium since they last changed the calendar. He had lived for roughly 10,000 years prior to that time, and he had met sorcerers who claimed 10,000 years of life even before his birth. The histories of the Eldar stretch back 60 million years. He raised a great gauntleted hand to his chin, rubbing it in thought. He ignored the wave of awe and astonishment that overtook the helm. 60 million years was indeed a lengthy time. "Then speak the truth as you know it, Zeno," he declared. "Speak of this bile bastard, and for what reason my son has agreed to invade its domain. I have little reason to heed or dismiss your words yet." The Zeno nodded and began to speak again. "Once the gods of the Eldar ruled over Sha'iel, chief among them Asaurian in gold. After the murder of Eldanesh, our greatest hero, at the hands of Kaine stained red, god of all martial things, Asaurian declared separation of gods and eld. This sundered reality in twain once more, into physical and spiritual, what you call reality and the warp. Mythic explanations of why the universe was the way it was. All faiths had such." The Zeno paused and shook his head. The Daemon Sultans, gods of chaos, had been old at this time, born in the turbulent warp in a far earlier conflict against the giants, bound in bones. They had been kept at bay by our pantheon for untold eons. The separation of God and eld was necessary, but allowed for a great rot to infest our society. Pleasure cults began to rise, and in time they encompassed the majority of our civilization. It was the Exodus, Lord Malekith, who first declared rebellion against these basal indulgences, and the first of the Exodite worlds were established in that era. Daemon Sultan, a name for a particularly powerful daemon, just another predator to put down in the end. Tilting his head, the Zeno took a moment before continuing. The first of the Exodite worlds would have been established roughly 50,000 years ago, coinciding roughly with the start of your people's histories. The ripples in Sha'iel from the actions of the pleasure cults began to manifest great storms in the wheel, the galaxy, and send many places into chaos. Your son referred to this period as the Age of Strife during the Moot. He stayed silent. His hands were carefully placed and relaxed upon the armrests of his throne. The Zeno was also silent for a moment, composing itself behind that helmet, then speaking. Eventually these pleasure cults had finished forging their new god. She who thirsts was born. Her birthplace was our homeworlds and capital, and upon birth she devoured 7/10 of our pantheon. At this he spoke, controlled and deliberate. The supposed birthplace of this warp predator. It is Cygnus X1, the current largest warp storm in the galaxy, and located northwards of Terra. Formed roughly 50 years prior. The Zeno considered that for a moment, before nodding. "That coincides with what I know of it, yes." His right hand crumbled the armrest of his throne with the horrid squeal of warping orichalcum. The grand sword of his will, protecting his fleet as it travelled through the warp, pulsed. It was difficult to estimate distances in the place of twisting narratives. An area of space perhaps half again, as large as the great projection of his will, burned with golden fire. Hundreds of thousands of lesser songs were incinerated in an instant. The flame continued to burn for a bit longer as his fleet moved through the warp. It took several moments for him to exhaust his deep fury and return to a state of control. So the urbanite Eldar were responsible for the Age of Strife, according to their own records at least. He burned this fact into his mind. This one could be lying to him, of course. He would need more information to act upon. If it were not a lie, he now had an obligation to put a sword through the belly of each and every urbanite he encountered. He'd make it a policy as soon as he determined a good method to tell the factions apart. Continue. His voice rippled out in the helm, brow blazing with golden-red flames. The Xeno was silent for a long moment, hands slightly shaking in response to his anger. He had little reason to be afraid. The Xeno had guest rights at the moment, and supposedly wasn't a part of the supposed pleasure cults regardless. The Daemon Sultans are now 4 in number. She who thirsts, he who roars, it which watches, that which decays. Many names are given to these 4, all of them insults in our tongue. 4, and if the new one was recently born, that would correspond to the 3 broad categories that he had identified over the course of his long life. Ah, he realized it now. Your people divide the warp predators into 4 broad divisions and give names to each division. He spoke with realization, again being careful to not give mythic titles to such creatures. It would not do to be poetic and accidentally cause inconvenient superstitions to rise. He had just finished putting down all the maddened psychers on Terra. Another outbreak would be incredibly inconvenient at the moment. The Xeno tilted its head in confusion. Nay, the Daemon Sultans divided themselves, their song pallid and crude imitations of our once pantheon. Your people swaddle warp mechanics in mysticism, he replied. Daemons, Daemon Sultans, mythic explanations to explain reality as it is. It is something common to the psychically sensitive, which I'm led to believe is every member of your species. The terms matter not. They are merely more beasts to kill or contain. It is reckless to dismiss such as mere spirit beasts. The Xeno argued. They are far more dangerous than mere beasts. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Slowly it escalated, growing louder and louder until he was roaring with gigantic mirth on his throne. Eventually winding down again, he replied with an amused rumble. Do you know what the metal of my arms and armor is? The Xeno shook his head. No. It has many names. Orichalcum, auramite. It is produced through a specific psychoactive refining process upon a specific type of warp entity corpse. Upon Terra, I have been slaughtering this type of warp entity for the past 2,000 years. He grinned. The ravening cults and maddened sorcerers declared these beasts gods, summoning them into vessels of flesh and blood for any number of mad reasons, usually fanaticism. The mightiest among these god-beasts could shake cities with their footfalls and destroy worlds if left unchecked. I turned their flesh and bones into meal and fertilized the earth. I turned their hides into garments and gave them as gifts. I turned their blood into molten alloy, and with it forged my arms and armor. Giving an amused look to the Xeno, he continued. They were called gods, and I killed them as beasts. He waved a hand, focusing his will to repair the golden armrest of his throne, which snapped back into place after a few moments, lines and dents in the metal smoothing out. Name them daemons if you wish, Xeno. Heap fear and titles upon them. I will continue to hunt and butcher them as I always have. Leaning back in his throne, he continued, bemused. Looking at the distance in the warp, they would not be at the supposed capital of his supposed son's empire for a short while yet. Narrowing his eyes at the budding warp storm, he resolved to take care of that as he entered, as a favor. You spoke of your pantheon, 7th tenths devoured. This relates to why my son has agreed to military incursion into the deeper warp. Yes, for the blight bastard has taken our mother goddess Isha into captivity. She was spared of being devoured, but is currently imprisoned in his rotten realm. Raising a hand to his chin again, he spoke. Tell me of your mother goddess. A semi-benevolent warp entity then, racially bound, bust. 60 million years. That was more than enough time for artificial warp entities to be deified by descendants of their creators. He had to handcraft the souls of his primarchs already. Doing so on a much larger scale is theoretically possible. The Xeno began to speak again, and the Emperor readied the sword of his will for the collision to come, starting the process of twisting it into an arrow. Baston, capital of Albion, was long readied for the warp storm to come, psychers watching as the storm front slowly approached their system to crash against their manifold warding runes. They were not ready for an immense drill-like projection of purest gold to crash through the storm, emerging over the course of the next few hours like an immense beast rising from the waves. The spin of the lance caught the approaching warp storm in its counterspin, blades of swirling light tearing apart the unfocused and self-destructive narratives, pulling all things into the immense rotation of the lance itself and disrupting the energies within. And the storm was unmade by light, which shone down on Baston as the approach of a man named the Emperor. Stretching his senses across the world, the Emperor frowned. 3 of his daughters were present, as was one soul of particular note, but his supposed son and one of his daughters was either hidden from him or not present. "You did send word ahead, Zeno, correct?" he asked to the Eldar, who had just spent the last hour and a half waxing poetically about their pantheon. One shattered god of violence, one missing god of mockery, one imprisoned goddess of life. It was quite the sorry state, if he were the judge of it. Zeno was in communication with an entity upon the world, judging from the state of his soul. After a moment he replied, "Rundasil and one of his sisters are apparently responding to an orc incursion against his southern worlds. It is unknown when he can return." The Emperor grunted. It was no large issue. He would simply have to travel there after checking upon the status of his daughters already present. These things happened from time to time, and he was already here. The ship Bucephalus, largest and mightiest in the Imperial fleet, slowly descended near the surface of Baston's capital. The anti-gravity measures were in full effect to prevent the ship from disrupting the very tectonics of the planet itself with the immensity of its scale. Presentation was important. Setting down the ship to face the rising sun, casting a shadow the size of a country behind it, Bucephalus descended upon the agreed landing location. Not for an actual landing, of course, but merely close enough for the longest retractable gangway to rest against the ground and allow for proper descent. The use of the Imperial teleporter for a theoretically social event, as this was not advisable. The longest ramp lowered down slowly. A great gate in the side of one of the ship's many hangar bays opened up to cast a burning light across the entirety of a silent city. The ramp itself was long enough to touch the earth from a height greater than the greatest towers on Baston, and wide enough to accommodate the march of a full Imperator Titan. It was not strong enough to accommodate such a Titan, but then again, little was. Imperators were quite heavy. At the head of an immense procession, the Emperor of Mankind strode. Following him were his adult daughters, Hathor, Lofton, Athena, and recently Fulgrim, a guard detail of his custodians. Behind them a number of Astartes, behind them a number of solar auxilia, each carrying the many united banners of Terra with them. Heralds announced their arrival with fanfare, trumpets and drums and hymns of praise. The humming choir of tech priests echoed out over the procession, ancient and honored wise men carrying containers of burning incense and plasma flames mounted upon high torches. As he descended, he saw the ones awaiting his arrival. 4, 8, and 14 were each present in formal wear, all fully grown as far as his eye could tell. With them was a senior tech priest, and several more eldar. He assumed they were exodites. The 2 in the very front of the procession were most notable. The male was tall and bound in muscle, similar to Siona's, wearing a cloak crafted from the hide of some immense reptile and armor plate of the same bone-white material as he usually saw Eldar wearing. His soul was strong and fiery. The woman's scale dwarfed all other Eldar he had seen before, a hair's breadth before 10 feet. Her hair was a light blonde, and her eyes a deep blue. Her form was undeniably attractive, full in figure and fair in skin. The woman's soul dwarfed all but his own. A calm, placid sea that rolled with gentle waves. Blue and sunlit, but concealing deeps that he could see no end to. An old and particularly powerful Eldar them, he would take heed to ensure he was not taken off guard. After many minutes of steady march, he stepped off the ramp and onto the white stone of the courtyard below. In lockstep, the immense procession behind him immediately stopped. Letting his gaze travel across each subject before him, he waited to be formally greeted. The Eldar woman shifted, opening her mouth to speak. So she was in nominal command, or perhaps merely the highest ranking for social events. He turned his gaze to her. "You have such beautiful eyes." She spoke with a warm smile and fluttering ears. For the first time in a very long time, the Emperor was caught utterly off guard. Much work had been done in the last 6 cycles since the moot. His friend's people were relatively squat, short-lived, soul-blind, and primitive for the most part. That, as he had come to learn, concealed a rather Volish people, industrious, darkly humoured, and honourable in their own manners. Of greatest note was their sheer variety, which took some time for Asanil to understand. Men came in just about 100 different species, it seemed. Not just varieties of coloration and underlying structure, but in entirely alternative general shapes, general scales, general attributes, and even additional appendages. Yes, humanities included variations of race that included Jirinx-like features, horns and hooves, more than eld stature at the cost of near-animal intellect, aquatic adaptations, and in one most notable example, outright scales. Such variations among the eld were almost always the product of idle tampering on discrete individuals, not sweeping changes to entire sections of the population. He had complained at that time, to his ever-frowning friend, that humanity was a dozen races wearing the skin of one. That performative rant brought a rare and treasured chuckle and smile to Roboot's face. Those were becoming more common as the cycles went on, a very good thing indeed. Now, if only he and Miriel would stop circling each other as binary stars, the intercourse would be good for him. It was certainly good for him. He and Briaka were currently on their 3rd child, working on the 4th. Many sons to squire and daughters to tutor, a most excellent thing to have. By tradition, each Exodite couple was to have 10 to prepare for the war to come. Many had gotten close to finish during the initial voyage of Charnak, and currently the Exodite world swelled with packs of eldlings. Roboot had an unshakable grin on his face the first time a collection of the eldlings demanded he play games with their troop. He often visited exotic worlds in the Southern Wheel to facilitate one deal or another, and Asanil knew that he always dedicated at least 1 hour to this gentle play. This great swelling in population, of course, came with a great increase of demand for foodstuffs and raw goods to maintain good living standards among the Exodites. This was in accordance with Roboot's designs. There was no currency that could be easily exchanged between the various populations of men and eld, something that Roboot was greatly concerned with. He was oft concerned with matters of payment and debt, seemingly ignorant to all that he had already given to them with the message of Isha's survival and oaths of aid. Roboot insisted on payments to all eldar that performed services for Albion directly, namely, the constantly busy bone-zingers. The payments he eventually settled upon were these raw goods required to feed such a swell in population. From the many feudal worlds of men came a great surplus in foodstuffs after they were updated to the standards of his friend. Canned salt meat, pemmick, whey bread, grain and meal, various foodstuffs that could survive very long voyages relatively easily. The same forms of long-term foodstuffs the Exodites themselves prepared similar equivalents to. Roboot himself insisted on his own forces being given what he called primarchs, similar to pemmick as far as Asanil could tell, being a block of nutrition bound with fat and sealed in a type of recyclable container. Supposedly 3 could sustain a man for an entire day, and they could be stored for decades without spoilage. Asanil had tried one once. It tasted like metal and salt, and was dry and all around rather unpleasant to eat. Roboot insisted on outlining all of the supposed merits for soldiery. Asanil had argued it wasn't even fit for scavengers. Roboot had eventually relented and reassigned the blocks to emergency rations instead of standards, complaining the whole time about the loss of efficiency. The payments of foodstuffs were rather quaint, as Exodite worlds were quite skilled in the subtle magics of farming and ranching, but more than acceptable to assuage his friend. Then his friend returned with the Everqueen, avatar of their mother goddess, and thought long lost to their people with her disappearance several eons ago. Apparently he had stumbled across her in a hole in the ground of one of the night worlds he brought into the fold. He had found the Everqueen in a hole in the ground on a random human world. Asanil had to bind his soul in gold to prevent the hysterics, a maelstrom of many colors swirling in his soul. The first emotion he let himself feel, after ensuring all needs of the Everqueen were seen too, was deep red as he grabbed Roboot by the cuff of his tunic and shook him about. A hole in the ground. had their Everqueen in it this entire time. What do you mean you still want to pay my people back? We're in your debt 1,000-fold, you big, bumbling statue. That had been followed by 2 terrifying years of ensuring Sharnak did not fall under the constant siege of fuchsia and pale green washing against its world spirit. He was fortunate that so many world singers and appeared and thrown their full efforts into preserving their Everqueen at the cost of his world. Sharnak, once a place of sparse construction and wild, untamed lands, had quickly been built up as one of the greatest defensive strongholds he had ever seen. The World Tree, now surrounded by white walls and towers, enough to render it a small mountain city in its own right, and dozens of cities springing to existence like weeds to house the massive influx of pilgrims and warriors, all coming to see and swear themselves to their returned Everqueen. His once humble inner sanctum was not enough. He had to commission a brand new shrine capital on his world. Spitefully, he replaced the entirety of his former favorite mountain with it. The view was already ruined, might as well force his fellow dragon lords to pay for its complete reconstruction into a new holy city. Sharnak was getting civilized, and it disgusted him. It was an unfortunate requirement of housing the strength of eld required to protect their Everqueen during her pale blue song. It had ended sooner than he thought, the mournful tones weighing heavy upon his world in that time, and thankfully done. Everqueen had begun to educate herself on the matters of the modern courts, and had decided to take up her ceremonial duties once more, despite their insistence that she need not do a thing. Just her good living was more than triumphant enough for his people. Things had begun to resume their normal paces, standard everyday events. Worlds constantly being brought into the fold, ships always in transit, more and more bone song ringing out on each and every nearby system. One of the Farseers, upon predicting a troublesome orc invasion in the south, informed Roboot. His friend decided it was a good opportunity to ensure his youngest sister was educated in war matters by aiding him in the defense. All was as expected. Orcs were everywhere. You would never run out of them for practice in warfare, and the green-skinned warriors indeed preferred it that way. Then they received word from the east. The Emperor of Mankind, Roboot's father, was on his way to meet his son, at the head of a fleet of thousands of warships, many equal to or larger than any of the modest Exodite fleets, with soldiers that outnumbered the stars in the sky. A projection of his psychic will shearing through the tangles of the warp as a knife cuts taut twine. Each of the sisters and all peoples of import were quickly called to Baston as soon as possible. Fortunately, most were still close by and able to return within the months it took for the father to arrive. All except Roboot himself and the sister with him, currently in the midst of an important defensive campaign that had escalated to requiring his personal attention. He spat many curses at Sigorach. The moment that message returned to him, the god jester was almost certainly laughing at him. Specifically, he was only polite to rage in the proper manner. He had the honor of arranging the ceremonies of the father's arrival, taking command of the world from the world steward of Baston, and working tirelessly to get all the affairs in order. He thought himself quite prepared to meet with the man-god that could plant a new golden spoke into the wheel with his will. It was a close thing in the end, because he recognized the shape of the soul that burned its way through the sea of many colors, through Shael, the hell that daemons dwell within. He recognized it from old legends of the questing birds of Asurian, dread things of storm songs and golden fires, wild sunfire gods tamed by Kurnus and gifted to his golden father as hunting raptors and honor guards. Male Shael Atharakia, the beautiful eagle from hell that brings an end to all things. He had thought they had all been devoured with Asurian, consumed by she who thirsts during her dreadful birth. Yet here was one wearing the skin of a human. Here was one that was dissipating, a hellstorm with the flexing of its wings. Here was one casting a grand golden shadow over the system and driving daemons before it. How could it be anything else? It descended in a ship unlike any other, immense in scale in a manner only the Eldar flagships could hope to compare to, plated in immense gold of a deeper-than-mortal hue and covered in Vorlish long guns. It descended, engines of grand materium design pumping energies into the fabric of reality, about it, countering the immense pull that such a massive vessel brought with it. An enormous ramp descended from the side and sliding down to touch against the stone of the courtyard with a feather-light touch. There, in the center of the colossal doors that opened with the descended staircase, stood the father of Hobut, the Emperor of Mankind, burning, winged, eagle-helmed, star-crowned, lightning-clawed, storm-heralding, light-casting, and bringing with it a song of wrathful drums and melancholy strings. The flesh it wore was immense, bronze-skinned and as tall as a wraith-lord, clad in heavy, mannish power mail and bearing the mantle of an immense white great gyrinx of some variety. One step after another, it descended. Minutes that felt like moments as the immensity of the Sunfire Spirit approached, flanked by a heralding host, followed by the godling sisters of his friend, followed by a procession of men and women in golden plate, then a procession of smaller men in plate under 20 banners, then a procession of regular-sized humans in plate and mesh, all of which was interspersed with humming priests with red robes and tattered souls. Here it was, standing before him and the collected greeting host, and currently raising a single blinding brow at what Lady Everqueen just said. Asarnil traced through his memories of the last few seconds, before blanching in white horror. Before he could speak to salvage the potential disaster, the Asuryani eagle spoke in the booming rumbling of approaching thunder. In a most archaic and difficult-to-parse Terran, he declared with eyes hidden behind the sun upon his brow, "By witness, High Priestess, thy grail spilleth ove, Boss plus." The Everqueen's ears flickered in merriment. All else was silent. Asarnil took a moment to translate. A dawning horror began to settle over him. Honored friend Malum Kaido had gifts prepared for your arrival, in case he was not here to personally deliver them to your hands. Asarnil spoke some time later. Processions distributed to the massive feasting fields prepared, and the many thousands of cooks with their many thousands of pots preparing hearty stews. It would not be enough by his initial estimate, for the Starhawk had brought with him entirely too many mouths to feed. Modest, mostly sentimental things, knowing the great fortune already available to your domain, he considered that more valuable on such scales as these. He was desperately doing his best to ignore what had happened and what was occasionally still happening. The Starhawk replied, followed by his honor guard and a few select servants. His daughters had gone with their own guards to socialize with their sisters in some manner. The Emperor of Mankind had already made his intention to check on their health and minds apparent. Verily, it has been said that he campaigns in the south. Is this truth as ye know it? Plus Asarnil nodded, flanked by his own host of storm-cloaked guards and striding next to the Everqueen as they approached the central table of the great structure. Her honor guards were slightly too large to fit inside the grand gazebo, 10 honored Wrath Knights that now flanked the open-air structure with construct hands resting upon massive ghost glaives staked into the ground. Drawn from the greatest souls from the world, towers of each exodite world, old Malwan himself now among equally ancient peers, and delighting in the exchanging of half-remembered songs of elder days. Prophecies warned of an orc incursion upon a system he intended for conquest, San Lior if you know it. Not wishing for it to be ravaged too badly, he had quested forth to defend it and bring it into the fold of Albion. By last message, the incursion does indeed require his personal fleet. Will you wait for his return? A brief, nasal exhale from the Emperor. Nay, we shall remain here for a Terran week, then venture south to join him. Ye shall provide the coordinates of this world. Asarnil was almost irritated at being given a command, but this was overshadowed by the simple pleasure of not having to deal with hidden meanings and shadowed desires, as his people were prone to having. A blunt declaration of intent and demand for information was much preferable. What was less preferable was the need to feed that many humans for an entire human week. He would have to open the stockpiles and order the butchering of yet more livestock. Very well. The duration of a Terran week is 168 standard human hours, correct? We shall send another message ahead, informing him of your imminent arrival. Reaching the table and the contents upon them, Asarnil turned and gestured at the items. First, a large pile of tomes. For you and your machine priests, copies of all of the STC design patterns he and his forces have yet discovered. The red-robed priest in attendance, soul frayed on every angle and flesh overwhelmingly replaced in insect-like materium craft, shifted at that. Asanil could not tell what emotion the human was feeling at the moment, soul too unfamiliar to his sight. The Emperor nodded. Then, another large pile of tomes. For you and your select agents, updated copies of all the tomes, yet written by Malum Kaido's hands. 2 of which are updated intelligence on the manifold enemies of the wheel, and 1 of which is a primer he has prepared about the Eldar for future diplomacies. The Emperor nodded. Then the Everqueen took over the gifting, something that Asanil wished to interrupt, but was unable to. He instead flicked his ear tips in distress as she strode over to the great lockbox and opened it. If it were anyone else, he could have glared them into not moving. But this was the Everqueen. Asanil could not bear to go against her wishes. Reaching into the box and raising the item within, Asanil once more beheld the weapon Robut had commissioned some years prior for this event. A specially sized star glaive, the traditional weapon of the commanders of entire war hosts. Each High Dragon Lord had one as a symbol of officer, even if it was not required to use such. Asanil's own was mounted above his throne. He was never comfortable with the polearm, preferring to use his grand diclave as his proper war-arm. Robut had commissioned it from the same smith that had constructed his armor originally. Forger Singer Gamil was all too happy to produce such, even as they had to assign a cleric to him to make sure he didn't die while working on the weapon. The golden arms of Robut's father were used as reference during the process. The floor of the forge was painted in Gamil's own blood by the end. Furrowing his brow slightly, Asanil chanced to look to the nearly identical sword on the Emperor's belt. Not even a headache when his gaze crossed over it. The song of pain Robut's sword radiated was of the tragedies that once were then. The tragedies he rarely ever spoke of, but often drifted off thinking about. The Everqueen stepped forwards, holding the weapon that was sized for a Wraithlord, about perfect for the Emperor himself. A long blade with a gentle taper and gentler curve as it approached the end, fitted with a spirit stone that was currently unfilled and a disruption field generator, mounted upon a long sturdy shaft and paired with a bright lance laser gun that ran along the back of the blade. Its name is Aglan Aethmagil, the Everqueen declared, raising it up before her at chest height. She smiled up at the Emperor, who Asanil assumed was looking down behind that burning light. Sunray, which smites the horizon, in your tongue. Your son had ordered it song-forged for your hand. We hope that it will serve you well. Raising it slightly higher for him to take, Asanil had the unfortunate realization that the Everqueen was strategically aiming his gaze through offering the weapon. The Emperor reached down, taking the weapon in hand. The Everqueen had timed her breathing to inhale at that moment, her ears fluttering in silver-green patterns. Asanil despaired. The Emperor raised the weapon up, looking upon its crafting and running a finger along the edge of the unpowered blade. A small smile grew on his face. A vision of beauty, Pless, the Emperor commented, head not shifting. It took the Everqueen's smile widening for Asanil to realize that his gaze was probably upon her, not the weapon. He wished to wake from this horrid dream. He almost preferred open hostility.